Okay then. I think we're recording and stuff. Hail audience. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 150. I am your host, unkempt, unwashed, fresh out of bed, Panyo Basa. And I was asked to do this live, like the 150th episode of question and answer, do it live. And so I made a conscientious effort to remain alive before doing this. And so I am live right now. I am living anyhow. I'm alive. Pretty much. Sort of. Kind of. I guess. Mostly. And did I mention that I'm your host, Panyo Basa? Pretty sure I didn't mention that this is my beverage. So we got like a moderate amount of questions this time, which I would hope we'll be finished with in less than 2.5 hours, as I sit before you, unwashed and unkempt, wearing my custom-made Lithuanian linen robe. Have another sip of coffee. And I guess I'll just wade into these questions. And because I'm doing this live, if you can somehow find a chat, you can ask questions there. But good luck with that. So let's just wade into this. And my braided beard. See, I'm in training to become a Viking. I'm considering supplementing my income by making like pillaging raids on local small towns. But I think the beard's gonna have to get a little bigger. And also I gotta get a dragon boat. Because whoever heard of Vikings raiding small towns without a dragon boat? You know what I'm saying? So that'll be a little while. Let's just start answering questions here, shall we? Yes, we shall. And the first question is from Romeo. And Romeo says, I need your feedback on how to better accept 2 recent dystopian developments. First, I recently flew from New York City to Dallas to visit family. As if the long and intrusive TSA security check-in process wasn't bad enough, the airports now have facial recognition technology during check-in. Although facial recognition is now optional, it seemed like I was the only one who refused it. Of course, it is only a matter of time that it becomes mandatory. Yeah, they're probably doing it automatically without your permission anyway. Let's see. Besides being taken aback at how I was the only one who refused the face scan at the airport, the conversations that I have had with friends and family since then have thrown me for a loop as well. Most people have reacted with an indifferent shrug of the shoulders when I have brought it up. I'm not sure what I am more freaked out about, the rollout of the technology itself or the sheepish way that some people seem to be embracing it. The second recent foray into dystopia that has me freaked out happened a week or so ago when President Trump hired AI surveillance company Palantir to create a centralized database on American citizens. I voted for Trump and generally support him, but he definitely lost me on that one. While I still like him overall, Trump's bringing in Palantir has definitely increased my black-pilled sense of doom and gloom. It has made me feel like both sides of the political spectrum are pretty much controlled by the technocratic elites, and that any resistance to the sinister plans they have in store for us is futile. Anyway, I'm having a really hard time accepting these developments. We haven't got to the question yet here. Anyway, I'm having a really hard time accepting these developments and my resulting negative emotions with equanimity. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this subject as well as your response to the following questions. Okay, we're getting to the questions now. 1, this is the first question. That's why he puts a 1 in front of it. You often stress how important one's mental state is and how one should react to the world with as little clinging and aversion and as much equanimity as possible. However, aren't some things, namely civil liberties and personal privacy, worth clinging to and not accepting with such passivity? Well, I mean, if you really want your civil liberties and personal privacy, you may want to go out into a forest. If you don't want to renounce the world and just sleep under a tree, just opt out of society in general, I mean, you just go like Thoreau, live in a cabin by a pond somewhere. But so long as you are participating in an increasingly technological society, then this kind of shit's just going to keep happening. So, let's see here. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's already like security cameras at airports that are like singling out faces pretty much all the time. And I mean, you can just avoid flying, I guess. Maybe in future avoid driving. But one thing you got to bear in mind is that, I mean, our own mind is creating our reality. That your own karma is arriving at fruition all around you, so to speak. So, sort of like Eckhart Tolle says in his first famous book, it's like struggling against the external world is sort of like, you know, looking into a mirror and just like defying the reflection in the mirror and blaming the reflection in the mirror for the problems you're having or whatever. We are creating our own reality. And so you can have a certain amount of comfort in the idea that you have good enough karma in Pali, that you're not just going to get plunged into this hellish dystopia, cyberpunk dystopia. So that's one reason I assume why people, science fiction writers like back in the 1960s and 70s were predicting all this weird shit that was going to be happening. And things really haven't changed that much up until recently. I mean, since the 70s and until now, the main change is everything's digital and you got the internet, which has just revolutionized just world society, has revolutionized civilization, partly because you can bypass the official propaganda like outlets that have always been there, but now you can like bypass them and get your news from some guy in his pajamas sitting in his bedroom with $100 webcam, that kind of thing. And sometimes that guy in his pajamas, not me of course, is a robe, not pajamas, but that guy, I mean, sometimes he has more viewers than the networks now, some of those guys. And also he might, in some cases he knows less, but at least he's more honest as a general rule. He might be just as biased, but at least he doesn't have like marching orders from above telling him what he has to talk about, what he's forbidden to talk about, unless, of course, it's some fake grassroots thing that the Democrats are paying for or some such. So, let's see. What's the actual question, though? You often stress how important one's mental state is and how one should react to the world with as little clinging and aversion and as much equanimity as possible. True. That's basic Dhamma there. However, aren't some things, namely civil liberties and personal privacy, worth clinging to and accepting with such passivity? Well, you can adopt sort of the samurai mentality, or even like a Gandhian satyagraha, spiritual warrior kind of mentality, and just, peaceful non-cooperation, I guess it's called. And then take whatever lumps you're going to get for doing that, just with equanimity. Philosophical detachment, if you will. So, yeah, you can like make efforts to preserve your civil liberties and personal property not necessarily with lots of clinging. I mean, you can still do it philosophically. It's just like your duty, your sacred duty. It's the right thing to do, so you just do it. You know, it's like your dharma from a more Hindu point of view. And, you know, like the Hindus teach, like the Bhagavad Gita teaches, you know, if it's your duty to slaughter your own relatives. But let's just move on to the next question here, because I think they're all pretty much along the same lines. So, second question. If the Buddha were around today, would his renunciation of the world include this technological dystopia, or would he fall in line and accept it like everyone else? And again, this is second guessing a Sammasambuddha's mental states, which is kind of silly. And really, if the Buddha were around today, I mean, where would he be around? Would he be like in northern India like he was last time? Or would he be like in San Francisco? So, if the Buddha arose in India today, there's a good chance he would have just gone like he did the last time, just renounce the world, just go off and live in what remaining forests there are in northern India. I guess around Kashmir, foothills of the Himalayas, there's still big forests. I assume. I've been to India before. I didn't see any big forests, but then again, we were like in the Ganges Valley going to Buddhist pilgrimage sites. So, I mean, but if the Buddha arose in the West, you know, like the Buddha he's like Teddy in the Salinger story, who was born in New York, like Manhattan or something, then he might have to be, you know, just at least somewhat conforming to the culture. And I mean, I would doubt that he would allow monks to have cell phones, that kind of thing. But I mean, some technology, like the implication of the whole little story before the questions is, I mean, some of it's pretty much unavoidable so long as you are going to remain in society. And even though a Buddhist monk is supposed to renounce society, still, I mean, you're on the outskirts of it. You're still, you know, participating in it to some degree as an outsider. You can't completely cut yourself off from the culture. I mean, you wouldn't even be able to speak the same language as other people if you did that. So you have to participate in the culture to some degree. And where a fully enlightened being, and different fully enlightened beings might have different attitudes. You know, they're not all just going to be exactly the same psychologically, at least from an empirical point of view. So, I mean, some might make different calls than others. So it's hard to say. Even setting aside second guessing the mental states of a fully enlightened being. So, I mean, I'm sure that he would keep it to a minimum at the very least. I mean, smartphones and stuff, I'm kind of skeptical, but who knows? You're second guessing a fully enlightened being. They would know better than us what they're going to do because they're the ones who's doing it. So, I'm just going to move on to the third question here. Also from Romeo. Is that correct? Yep. And the Romeo's third question is, regarding this dystopia, what is the middle path between the sheepish shrug of the shoulders of a conformist normie and getting all worked up over it like I am? Well, I mean, just philosophical detachment and just do what you think is right regardless of any blowback or pushback you're going to get from the NPCs. So, I mean, there's a question kind of along these lines farther down that it reminded me of a quote from Krishnamurti that I actually looked up last night. So we'll get to something else along this line. But really, I mean, you just do, I mean, if you really are just determined to be like a saint, you've got to follow your own conscience. You got to do what you think is right, regardless of what anybody else thinks. And that's one reason why there's a saying in Catholicism that when one monk at a monastery becomes a saint, all the rest become martyrs. because saints can be difficult to get along with. You know, they're just uncompromising in following their own standards. I mean, that's one of the things that makes a saint. Not necessarily a sage. A sage and a saint aren't necessarily the same person. But a saint, you got to be, to some degree, like an asshole, like Mahatma Gandhi was. How good of a saint he was, I'm not exactly sure. But, I mean, he was like that. I mean, he would just vehemently insist on just living up to his own standards and, to some degree, making the people around him, especially his wife, live up to the same standards. I mean, he was making his wife, who was like I guess they were Vaishyas. They belonged to the Vaishya caste of India, which is, you know, this sort of the white castes. You know, it's like they're the descendants of the rank and file Indo-Aryan invaders, supposedly. And so, you know, they're supposed to know the Vedas and all that, at least to some degree. And he was making his wife, who was, you know, a respectable Hindu woman, clean the like the bedpans of like Christian Dalits and this kind of thing. You know, sort of like the outcast Hindus, the untouchables who had converted to Christianity or some such. And he was making her like clean their toilets and this sort of thing. And one time he just got like annoyed with her and just was dragging her out of the house, just throwing her out of the house because she wasn't smiling when she was doing it. So, I mean, saints can be this way, even if Mahatma Gandhi is not the best possible example of a saint. I mean, he was giving it a shot. He was trying to be a saint, even if he did not fully succeed. So, let's see here. And the computer screen that I use as kind of a light for lighting my face up a little better is my sweetheart hasn't turned on her computer all the way, so it just kind of keeps going on and off because I have to keep hitting the space bar because it's not logged in. You just kind of get the screen for logging in or whatever, and then it doesn't last and it goes back off. But it is daytime, so I guess it's not even necessary. So you can see like in the mirror, where is it? Right there. There's like daylight coming through the window, which is unusual because I usually do these Q&As at night because I work nights, like, and so I'm used to getting up late. And so then on weekends I still get up late. Got up at like a little after 11 today, which is just like an ungodly hour for me to get up now. So anyways, let's just move on to the next question. This is from Ceovaction Sipad Zidana. And this, I'm going to keep bending this sideways. Okay. Ceovaction Sipad Zidana says, what kind of karma is this? And then he like included this or attached this kind of a meme from, it looks like it's from 4chan. And it's mainly just sort of a list of things with like little arrow things. It says, B16. Hear dogs obviously attacking something in backyard. Go out and get them to leave it alone. Oh shit, it's a bloody possum. Think it's dead, go to put it in garbage. Notice it's still breathing. Decide to put it out of its misery. Grab a broken skateboard and smash it over its head. Possum starts convulsing. Oh God, why aren't you dying? Keep beating it. Feel like Christopher Bale killing Jared Leto in American Psycho. I never saw the movie. It finally dies. Check the body and see the dogs barely scratched it. MFW, I think that means my face when I remember that possums play dead. And Seal of Action Sipad Zidana says, what kind of karma is this? Well, there's obviously some bad karma involved. Choosing to put the possum out of its misery. I mean, that's like a deliberate act to kill this possum that was still alive, even though there's some compassion that's sort of ameliorating the karma. You know, it's not just pure black bad karma, anything like that. You know, there's a certain amount of compassion, but then you decide to just bash its brains out or whatever, just put it out of its misery still you're making bad karma from a Buddhist point of view. Like, what is it? Euthanasia is still immoral from a Buddhist point of view, even if the person or whatever it is that's being euthanized is in terrible pain and isn't going to get better. So, I mean, I've kind of done similar things. I mean, not really with regard to, like, I mean, I've probably done that before too, where you just sort of compassionately try to euthanize something that is in pain. Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, I was reluctant to do that. I remember one time when I was a kid, my dad started the car and there was like a half-grown kitten under the hood of the car. It had climbed up inside and it got chopped up in the fan when the car started and mangled the cat up. And then the cat starts dragging itself away from the car. My father tells me, go get the .22 rifle. You know, we gotta put this cat out of his misery. And he wanted me to shoot the cat because I was a better shot than him as he was getting older and his eyesight wasn't as good. I didn't want to do it. You know, I just couldn't bring myself to shoot this cat who really hadn't done anything wrong other than just make the wrong choice with regard to where it was going to be hiding that day. And so my father said, all right, I'll do it. And then he shoots, doesn't kill the cat, and then it like crawls underneath the house. You know, it makes it underneath the house. Now it's not only mangled up by the car fan, but it's also got a bullet hole in it. So if I had actually done that and I had, you know, I was a better shot, there's a better chance that I would have finished off the cat. But so it was sort of like, I didn't want to make the bad karma, but it wasn't really, I wasn't thinking about karma. It was just sort of like this soft-hearted compassion that I've always had for animals. You know, I just felt sorry for the kitty, you know. I didn't want to kill it. But in that particular case, the amount of bad karma generated might have been less than my father just kind of winging it, putting a bullet hole in it, and then the cat still manages to get underneath the house where, of course, we're not going to find it. So, golly. Yeah, that was his main mistake, was to put it out of its misery, especially because apparently the possum wasn't in misery at the time that he decided to put it out of its misery because it was unconscious. Apparently, according to this here thread or meme or whatever it is, that, I mean, the possum was like feigning unconsciousness or feigning death. You know, it's just motionless, acting like it's dead, playing possum. So, yeah, I think the call to put it out of its misery was just like a mistaken. That was his final failure in this case. So, yeah, I mean, it's not pure bad karma. There's definitely bad karma mixed in, and especially, I mean, he's gone to the trouble of like making this meme, which means that, you know, it could be years later. He might be way more than 16 years old now. And, you know, it's still sort of like bugging him. And that could be where most of the bad karma is coming from. It's just like the guilty conscience. You know, it's like, I fucked up. You know, next time I won't smash an unconscious possum with a skateboard. And then just move on with your life. You know, I mean, you didn't know. You thought that it was, you know, fatally, like mortally wounded or something. So it could be that most of the bad karma he's getting is just from the guilty conscience, or just sort of like the, you know, sort of some minor PTSD or something from the experience. And that's the way a lot of things go. I mean, sometimes by far the worst karma you get is just the guilty conscience and just the trauma and all this stuff that you're working through for years afterwards. I mean, if you could just make the mistake, acknowledge you made the mistake, you know, acknowledge it was an honest mistake, you know, I didn't know, and then just continue, you know, forgive yourself and continue moving forwards, you're going to be doing a hell of a lot better, even from like a spiritual point of view, a Buddhist point of view, than to just keep like beating yourself up over some mistake you made years ago. I mean, that's just foolish. It makes things worse, because no amount of beating yourself up over it is going to change that event in the past. So I think I'm just going to move on to Siovakjan Sipadzirna's next question. He says, I've heard people, and then in parentheses it says Gabor mate. Probably not pronounced mate. I'm just saying that just because. So anyways, Siovakjan Sipadzirna says, I've heard people say the West is a guilt-based culture, while many other places are a shame-based culture. He claims guilt is a feeling. I guess he's talking about Gabor here. He claims guilt is a feeling about an action, while shame is a feeling about one's inherent self. I always thought shame was better, as you avoid doing things in the first place, although I don't know about Gabor's definition, as I'm not a psychologist, so he may be onto something. Which one do you think is personally better as an individual and society? So there's what is called guilt here. Guilt is a feeling about an action, and then shame is a feeling about one's inherent self, which from the Buddhist point of view is more delusional than, the feeling about an action. That according to Orthodox Theravada, at least, actions are more real than inherent selves are. But this is sort of, it reminds me of the two kinds of virtuous, or, virtuous, wholesome, skillful shame in Buddhism, hiri and ottappa. Sometimes you'll see that, like it's mentioned in the suttas numerous times. Hiri, ottappa, it's just this pair. Usually they're found together, hiri and ottappa. And those are like the two wholesome kinds of shame. There's also like the unwholesome kind of shame, which is called kukucha. That's like a guilty conscience, like I was just talking about with regard to the guy who beat the possum to death with a skateboard. It may be most of his bad karma is coming from this like guilt that he's experienced, and that's kukucha. That's always bad karma. A guilty conscience always creates bad karma from a Buddhist point of view. Go figure. So hiri ottappa, it's not exactly the way Mr. Gabor explains guilt and shame, but it's kind of similar. Whereas hiri is like, you don't want to do something evil. You don't want to do something unskillful. It's sort of like you don't want to touch shit or something. It's just like conscientiousness. Whereas ottappa is more like you don't want the evil consequences of that action. So it's like with hiri, there's this urge to kill your boss or something. I'm not suggesting anyone kill their boss, but it's just like you just recoil from that. It's like, no, that would be wrong. Whereas ottappa, it's more like you want to do the same action, but what prevents you from doing is you don't want the bad consequences of doing it. At least that's like the official explanation of hiri ottappa. Sometimes in the Pali text, they'll just use a number of words, sometimes just two, that mean the same thing, essentially. Like initial and sustained thought in the description of the first jhana and second jhana and so forth. It could just be that they both meant the same thing. It's just that it's like an emphasis where you use two or more words that mean the same thing in ancient Pali texts. It does happen. But the official differentiation of hiri and ottappa, hiri is like recoiling from performing the action just because the action is unskillful, and ottappa is recoiling from doing the action because you don't want the bad consequences. So this could be, hiri would come closer to what Gabor is calling shame, and ottappa would be more what Gabor is calling guilt. And hiri, actually, in this case, is considered to be somewhat better. It's somewhat more virtuous, even though both are good, but still it's kind of a more noble kind of a feeling. You know, as long as they're preventing you from doing evil acts in the first place, not just doing evil acts and feeling shitty about it afterwards, but doing it just prevents you from doing the bad thing. It's like in Buddhism, if you're going to have scruples of conscience, you know, moral scruples, have it before you do the deed, not afterwards. Before is good if it prevents you from doing the deed. Afterwards just makes things worse. You're just adding more friction and misery to an already kind of mistaken situation. So what is the actual question here? Let's see here. Which one do you think is personally better as an individual and society? Well, as Gabor describes it, you'd be better off having feelings about an action. I mean, ultimately, for a monk, maybe for a layperson, just having a sense of honor and dignity. And, you know, I wouldn't stoop to that level, you know, like stealing something. You know, somebody at work leaves like a wallet full of money in plain sight. You could take it easily. Nobody would, you know, the security cameras, there aren't any, let's say. You know, you could do it. Nobody would know you did it. And, I mean, it's like the guilt that Gabor is talking about is, you know, I just wouldn't do such a thing. Whereas the shame that he's talking about is I wouldn't do such a thing. Whereas the guilt is, I don't know. It's like with Otapa, it's just like, I don't want to get caught, you know, otherwise I might do it. But, you know, or it's like, I don't want to get bad karma for doing it. I mean, that's just sort of along the same lines. You know, you don't want to get punished by your own karma or by authorities or whatever. So I guess in a case like that, what is called shame would be a little nobler, you know, probably more virtuous, better karma than wanting to do it and then just being afraid of getting in trouble or whatever as a result. That's a more childlike or dog-like approach to being a good boy. But I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, the feeling about one's inherent self, then it's ultimately delusional. But then again, you could say that actions also are kind of delusional ideas. So Hiri is probably better than Otapa, but both are way better than kukucha or guilt after the fact. Regardless of what kind of guilt it is, it's like, I shouldn't have done that, or I'm a bad boy, or whatever. You're better off without that. So I guess I might as well just move on to Siovak and Sipad Zidina's third question, which is, what is the biggest change you have seen in your generation growing up and today's generation? Well, I'm not exactly sure what today's generation would imply. Is that kids today? Like teenagers? I assume generation, what is it? Z? Are we up to Z? Z, for those of you, like in the UK? It's hard to say because there are a number of differences. I think the main change I have seen is that today's generation, younger people, are less independent than my generation. Like my generation, it was pretty common for teenagers to rebel and just rebel against grown-ups, rebel against society, rebel against the status quo. And I mean, you've got some rebels nowadays. I mean, some people are just juvenile delinquents. You know, they're just born that way maybe, or just, you know, for whatever reasons. Some people become like young Antifa, you know, soy terrorists, that kind of thing. But there's like an independence that my generation had. And the generation before me, like my parents' generation, it was even more independence, where kids would just go out and play until dark. No adult supervision. My father had these horror stories of shit that he used to do when he was a kid. Just wild kids, like in the 1920s and 30s in rural Georgia. It was like beyond my experience when he'd be telling me this stuff that he used to do when he was a kid. And I mean, what I used to do as a kid, is apparently beyond the experience of kids that they can't even walk to a park a block away unsupervised by adults. They'll have the cops called on them. There have been cases of kids playing in their own backyard unsupervised, and some neighboring Karen will call the cops or some kind of authorities just because the kids are playing without adult supervision. And so, yeah, even like Halloween, kids used to really go trick-or-treating for Halloween. Nowadays, not so much, just due to fear of strangers, fear of bad people, lower trust, partly because of diversity. I mean, it's pretty much a sociological, empirical fact that ethnically uniform societies, or just neighborhoods, are going to have higher trust than lots of different ethnicities of different cultures, kind of not really blending, but just living side by side. That you have less trust of your neighbor when your neighbor is speaking a different language from you in the privacy of their own home, that kind of thing, following different religions and so forth. So, I mean, that's part of it. Yeah, I mean, the society is more feminized now, and so you've got more feminized young people, less likely to take risks, also more averse to discomfort. I assume there's probably fewer hikers, or just fewer people roughing it camping out in the woods than when I was young, just because nowadays younger people, they pretty much just stay in the house, texting on their smartphone or playing video games, that kind of thing, watching TikTok videos, that kind of thing. So the internet has helped to bring that about, but I think in large part it's just the feminization of society, is sort of the emasculation of Western civilization is largely resulting in kind of softer, gentler, wimpier kids in general. That might be the biggest change. It's the one that occurs to me anyhow. So anyways, I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Newman. And Newman says, if karma is the natural law of cause and effect in the cosmos, and its natural trajectory is to reward wholesome, morally good actions and penalize unjust, unwholesome actions, doesn't this mean the cosmos and samsara is ruled by a just and good law, and thereby it isn't unwholesome in reality at all? Maybe I'm misunderstanding the Buddhist judgment of samsara and the cosmos. If something is governed and directed by a just or good principle, which finds its telos, it's like its end or goal, and fulfillment in liberation, there doesn't seem to be an antagonism here. Well, I've mentioned before that it really is kind of I got to change these hyphens into dashes because I'm kind of a grammar Nazi, possibly the only kind of Nazi that I have ever been is a grammar one. So let's see here, and I do spend considerable amount of time like fixing the grammar and the punctuation of these questions, just because I'm just that way. So anyways, yeah, it's a common misconception that karma is some natural moral law. You know, it's like a cosmic law, and it really is. It's not. Karma is not like set up by the cosmos to reward goodness and punish badness. That's just a common misconception that karma, in a way, is kind of cause and effect, you can say. Cause and effect in and of itself is not moral, but it's like if you hit your own hand with a hammer, it's going to hurt. But it's not like that is like punishment. You're being punished by hitting your own hand with a hammer. That is some sort of cosmic law of punishment, rewards and punishments, that the cosmic law has been set up in such a way that if you hit your hand with a hammer, you are punished for that action by feeling pain. I mean, it's just the natural consequence that if you move towards wisdom and liberation, you're going to suffer less. You're going to have less delusion, less like delusion-induced aversion and attraction and just friction with your surroundings. You're going to be more in harmony, more at peace, more equanimity, more acceptance than if you're like struggling against shit. So, I mean, it's just a natural consequence. If you move closer to wisdom and purity, you're going to have less like delusion and delusion-induced suffering. You move deeper into like just samsaric thinking and just, you know, look out for number one and screw everybody else, that kind of thing. Then, I mean, it's not like some cosmic law is punishing you. It's just that you're hitting your own hand with a hammer. You're just wading in deeper into delusion. And you're going deeper asleep, so to speak. And you just have more attraction and aversion, more craving, more desire, more attachment, and consequently, more suffering. It's not like you've got some divine force rewarding good and punishing bad. It's just that the definition of good and bad is good is what takes you closer to realization of reality, and bad is what takes you farther away from it. And I mean, it's just sort of like retrofitting cosmic justice onto just the way things work. You hit your own hand with a hammer, it's going to hurt. It's not like there's some cosmic law punishing you for hitting your own hand with a hammer. It's just when you hit your own hand with a hammer, it hurts. And all ethics in Buddhism is pretty much along the same lines. All suffering is self-inflicted, ultimately. So, I suppose I answered that one. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Pedro. And Pedro says, what do you think about the stoned ape theory? And the stoned ape theory, I've heard of it before, but I just looked it up real fast and got like the AI little blurb at the top of the search page saying that it was like Terence McKenna came up with this idea of the stoned ape theory that like proto-humans, very early humans or pre-humans, took psilocybin mushrooms, and this sort of consciousness expanding experience of taking the mushrooms helped humans to develop like language, because they want to be able to say, whoa, I just had a spacey experience, and describe it to their friend, you know, Og, sitting on the stump next to them. And it just sort of like opened their mind to greater creativity and so forth. And so what do I think about this theory that pre-humans or proto-humans taking like psychoactive drugs, especially mushrooms, helped us to evolve? It's an interesting theory. It's kind of plausible, but there's essentially zero hard evidence in support of it. It's just sort of an interesting idea that is like going with Karl Popper, pretty much of a useless theory because you can't really prove it one way or the other. I mean, it's just, yeah, well, maybe. And I would guess, I mean, there might be some influence of like cavemen getting stoned, sort of like making them more creative or more imaginative, or, you know, maybe helping along the development of human language, that kind of thing. But I don't think it would be the main reason. And it's like a hypothesis that is of, as far as I know, of no actual value from a scientific point of view or a philosophical point of view, because there's no way you could prove it one way or the other. It's just this idea, well, maybe that happened. Maybe it did. I don't know. And so I'm just going to move on to Pedro's next question here, which is, what is the best way to convince scientific materialists, aka atheists? And Pedro doesn't say the best way to convince them of what. I even asked in the comments, convince them of what, and I got no response. So I guess what is the best way to convince scientific materialists that maybe they're wrong, that scientific materialism does not explain reality? Well, it would depend on the scientific materialist, I guess. You have to kind of feel into what they're receptive to and so forth. But one way you might do it is to bring up parapsychology. And they might just go, that's all bullshit. That's all fraud. It's like a lot of really convinced scientific materialists, they look at the findings of parapsychology, and sometimes it's like they're backed up against the wall and they say, well, I don't know how they're cheating, but they got to be cheating somehow. And that's their debunking of that particular experiment, for example. But some parapsychological research, I've mentioned before that there are two fields in science that have the most carefully designed experiments, the most airtight experiments, and that is particle physics and parapsychology. In particle physics, you have to plan out the experiment as carefully as possible, because renting a particle accelerator in Switzerland or something is very expensive. You don't want to blow all this grant money on a shabbily designed experiment. But with parapsychology, you have to have a completely airtight experimental design, eliminating any chances of bias or fraud or anything like that. Because that these scientific materialists, like the amazing Randy, are just going to be attacking with hammer and tongs the results of your experiment. They're going to be looking as hard as they can for any defect and say, well, there you go, that's how they're cheating. So at least some intelligent, non-fanatical scientific materialists, you might be able to get your foot in the door using parapsychology. Just the results of parapsychology, like the findings of Helmut Schmidt, which still kind of blows my mind when I think about what Helmut Schmidt did, at least according to the parapsychology book I read. And I've described his experiments before. He was in charge of research at Boeing Laboratories. This was back in the 1950s or something. And it was slow going. They weren't working on anything. They weren't very busy. So Helmut Schmidt asked permission from the higher ups if he could do experiments on the effect of consciousness on physical systems. And, there's potentially some kind of advantage. Princeton University had its own lab based on that also. Maybe they still do. And so he started experimenting on the power of the mind to affect quantum randomness. So quantum randomness, we call it random because we don't understand it. Nobody's been able to come up with any way of predicting exactly how things are going to come out in a state of quantum randomness. And it turned out that people can't, there's a measurable difference from what you'd expect from random chance, predicting cards or dice rolls, that kind of thing. It turns out that, especially with some people, but in humans in general, that people can guess. It might be just 0.3% different from what you'd expect at random, just random guessing. But that 0.3%, if you're doing thousands of tests, it becomes statistically significant. And so Helmut Schmidt was doing that about just predicting random, statistically random events. It was based on radioactive decay and a Geiger counter, when the Geiger counter is going to click exactly. And he was able to record these Geiger counter clicks. And so long as nobody had listened to the tape, you could still influence whether it was going to be it was a random number generator of just ones and twos or zeros and ones. It was he'd translate that into clicks in stereo headphones. there, like a 1 would be a left click, and a 2 would be like a right click. A click in the left ear or a click in the right ear, and then right before the experiment, he'd say, all right, try to make more clicks be in the right side or more clicks be on the left side. And people would be using whatever psychic talent they had or any attempt at psychic talent to make the clicks be more random 1s or random 2s. And, it was like 0.3%, but the test only took a few seconds. Thousands of tests were done. And especially with some people, it was way better than 0.3%. And it turned out that he could record that on a cassette tape, because that's what they used back in those days when he was doing these tests. And so long as nobody had heard the cassette tape, you could still influence whether there's going to be more on the left or more on the right. It was like the cassette tape itself, the recording on the cassette tape was still in a state of quantum randomness. Until some perceiving mind collapses the state vector, it's still in a random state, like a potential state, which is interesting to me. And his naysayers, the scientific materialists, would be just saying, well, he's got to be cheating somehow. We don't know how he's doing it, but he's cheating. Because that's the best they can do, because his experimental design was just like foolproof. They could not find any defects in the experimental design, but they're saying, well, he's real clever because he's figuring out some way of cheating, because that's impossible. And that's just the attitude they have. Like a scientific materialist is, if it can't be scientifically measured, then it's bogus. Or if science can't explain it. But I mean, up until, not very long ago, well in the modern times, we didn't know how stars or the sun worked, but they obviously did. And you didn't have scientific materialists saying, well, stars don't really exist because there's no way that they could be burning all this time, because they didn't know about like nuclear fission and fusion and all that. So that would be the best way to convince some scientific materialists, is just try to get like the field of science that kind of questions materialism, even like theoretical physics. The whole idea that the perceiving mind is really determining certain processes, collapsing the state vector, or whatever the common term for that would be. Atheists, on the other hand, I mean, that's a whole different kettle of wax, isn't it? So I keep having to turn the computer screen back on. I'm just like hitting the space bar every few minutes. Although it's just kind of a darkish purple background, it might not even have a noticeable effect. So let's see here. I guess I suppose maybe I answered what the best way to convince scientific materialists, also known as atheists, would be, even though Pedro really never did explain to me what it is that you're supposed to convince them of. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Superlump. And Superlump says, why does the Buddha allow monks to use dung as deodorant? And then he actually gives the reference here. It's in the Mahavaga, the Vinaya Mahavaga, Book of Discipline, possibly the chapter on medicines, Volume 4, page 274. And I do not recall this. I mean, I'm not arguing against Superlump that he saw it in there. And it's probably referring to cow dung. Cow dung was used for all sorts of things in ancient India. And it has like an absorbent property. It sort of might have been like an ancient precursor of like talcum powder or something. So I would just be guessing that it's that. I'm sure the Buddha was not allowing monks to just like shit into their hand and smear it all over themselves. That, you're using probably cow dung in this case. I'm just going to move on to Superlump's next question that I can answer a little better. Why does Sudina's mother think smearing dung on the floor will help entice her son to disrobe. And this is from the Sutta Vibhanga Book of Discipline, Volume 1, page 28. And it's the origin story to the first Parajika rule, which is the Parajika rule against a monk having sex. So it's the very first origin story of a rule in the Sutta Vibhanga of the Vinaya Pitaka, of the Patimokkha rules. And smearing dung on the floor. In ancient India, the ancient Ganges Valley, cow dung was used to plaster floors, plaster walls. I mean, it's not like stinky shit like human shit would be, or cat shit or whatever. And it just had lots of purposes, used as fuel in fires. It's like an ingredient in plaster. It'd either be like cow shit mixed with clay as a kind of plastering for floors. Maybe in the origin story, it does say that they just spread cow shit on the floor, but it could have been mixed with clay, or it was. But I mean, the reason why they did that, I mean, cow shit was just a standard ingredient in floor plaster and wall plaster in the ancient times. It wasn't considered to be shit in like the sense of like human shit. And so what they were doing, it was, according to the story, Sudina was this monk who, I mean, his parents were very reluctant to give him permission. He went on a hunger strike to sort of coerce his parents into giving permission for him to become a monk, because you're not supposed to be ordained without your parents' permission. So he went on a hunger strike. They reluctantly granted him permission to become a monk. And then at some later time, he's just going for alms in town. He goes back to his hometown in his wandering. The parents hear about this, and so they're going to try and lure him back. And so, they fix the house all up, they clean everything, make it look nice. They plaster the floor with fresh cow poop. They put a pile of gold and a pile of silver, have his wife or ex-wife, dress up as good as she could, look as attractive as possible, this kind of thing, as a way of enticing him. So smearing shit on the floor was just making the house look nice, which is counterintuitive to modern Western people, but in the ancient Ganges Valley, that was just standard. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Super Lump, and also on the theme of shit in Theravada Buddhism, especially the rules of monastic discipline. And he says, do you have any stories about people using dung in such unusual ways? Well, I mean, cow dung, that's one thing. I mean, it did occur to me, though, when I read this question, that in Vinaya, in the rules of monastic discipline, there is a cure for snake bite that involves a monk's own shit. That you're supposed to combine the 4 like noxious materials, and I can't remember what the 4 are. I think it's like shit, piss, and then it's like dirt and ashes, something like that. And that was what they used as some folk remedy pre-scientific days in ancient India for snake bite. And apparently it's this idea, it's like sympathetic magic, really, more than empirical medicine. Sympathetic magic is, you're taking this icky stuff to cure you of this other icky stuff. It's like if the medicine you take is more unpleasant than the sickness, it's more likely to cure you of the sickness, kind of a deal. So yeah, there is that it is in the book of monastic discipline that you can actually use human shit, your own shit, as an ingredient in, if you're bitten by a viper or a cobra or something, that probably it was a kind of like a sympathetic magic that had, if anything, it was a placebo effect. And then because your mind really is generating a reality to a profound degree, that it can actually help. If you actually believe that it's going to cure you, it can help to cure you, just through the power of your own faith, so to speak. But aside from that, I really can't think of any other good uses for dung in the book of monastic discipline, although it's probably in there. Especially cow dung. It was just like this common material in ancient India, especially in ancient northern India, that had multiple uses that have been supplanted in later time by technological advances or whatever. Like snakebite, we generally use antivenom now, if we have it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Mooners. And Mooners says, what do you think of the Eastern Orthodox apologist or ortho-bro known as J. Dyer, or just ortho-bros in general? And that last part, or just ortho-bros in general, is making this question a little easier to answer because I'm unfamiliar with J. Dyer. I'm really unfamiliar with most of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but I have heard enough, like in social media and so forth, to know that Eastern Orthodox is considered by like right-wing Westerners to be the most based form of Christianity. The form of Christianity that is still like the most spiritual and comes closest to the original spirit of Christianity. It's like Eastern Orthodox Christianity is sort of like Theravada Christianity. So that's kind of what I think of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, is it's just a conservative form of Christianity that Western right-wingers are preferring over Catholicism and the various kinds of Protestantism. And I mean, it's not bad. Eastern Orthodox Christianity, it still has monasticism, renunciation, and it probably does come closest to the original Christianity, or at least it comes closest to ancient Christianity, like the Christianity of the early Roman Empire, than Catholicism or various forms of Protestantism. I mean, the Protestants, one of the first things they did was just abolish renunciation. So that wasn't exactly the best choice that the Protestants made. And Catholicism, notoriously, it's all bound up with Western paganism and so forth, and also is just sort of infiltrated by, gay child groomers and so forth, allegedly. Not that I'm denying it never happens. So, ortho bros in general, they're like Westerners who kind of lean to the right, and they want the most based, most legitimate form of Christianity they can find, and it's, to them, Eastern Orthodox, which is not a bad choice, I suppose. I've heard by many accounts that it really is kind of the most pure form of Christianity in existence. Although, I mean, it's not perfect. I've seen pictures of like Orthodox patriarchs, and they look kind of like Santa Claus. They got the big white beard and they're fat. And they're just decked out in like cloth of gold studded with jewels, wearing like crowns and this kind of thing. Which is not exactly in the spirit of early Christianity, but still, based on their practices and beliefs and so forth, I would consider it possibly the least objectionable form of Christianity. Because personally, I'm not a Christian, of course. Although, I mean, some of the Catholic monastic orders, I think, would still be relatively acceptable from a Christian point of view. Carthusians are nothing to sneeze your nose at. Discalced Carmelites. So, let's see here. Yeah, I guess I answered the question. I'm really no authority on Eastern Orthodox Christianity. I mean, it's got like a firm basis in mysticism, going all the way back to like the Pseudo-Dionysius, or even farther back to Paul of Tarsus. So, yeah, and it's good that it still has most of the early virtues of early Christianity. So, yeah, if you're going to be a Christian, Eastern Orthodox is certainly not the worst possible choice. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Stellar Supreme, etc., etc., etc. His name gets longer and longer. And Stellar Supreme says, what's the deal with the translation grammar here? And he quotes a verse from the Atthakavagga. It's the Duttataka Sutta, verse 6. And the Duttataka Sutta, it's one of the oldest suttas. I mean, it's a very old sutta. It's the Atthakavagga is considered to be archaic Buddhism, like pre-Theravada Buddhism. And the 4 Attaka suttas in the Atthakavagga, after which the Atthakavagga gets its name, they're called Attaka because it means octad, or group of 8. It's because there's 8 verses to each of these Attaka suttas. So that's considered to be like the core. That's like the oldest of the oldest. And so in the Pali, please forgive me if I mispronounce the Pali, because I'm used to Burmese pronunciation, which is bizarre to anyone who knows Pali who isn't in a Burmese tradition. So then I try to like translate it over to a more Western or Sri Lankan kind of pronunciation. And sometimes I just fall between 2 stools. You know, I sort of like mix it up. But anyways, it's DT, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the dotted T's correctly, because we just don't do that. Diti niwesa na hi swatiwata dame su nichea samugahita dasama narote su niwasane su nirasadi adiadi cha damam. Okay, so in my translation of that, and he's got my translation included in the question here, that says, indeed not easily got past are the entrenchments of views, seized having discriminated from among the philosophies. Thus a man amid those entrenchments discards, adopts a philosophy. And it's fairly straightforward. Like DT niwesa means entrenchments to views. DT is view, niwesa is like entrenchments or like clinging to. Na is not, he indeed, suwatiwata easily got past. So indeed not easily got past are the entrenchments of views. First line, fairly straightforward. Although in poetry, you have to rearrange the words, especially in Pali poetry, old Pali poetry, or even proto-Pali poetry. You got to rearrange the words in order to fit the meter, because you have to have this meter, this regularity of the short and long syllables, short and long vowels, because that's how meter is. Poetic meter is based on long and short vowels in Pali more than in English, where it's like stressed and unstressed syllables. In Pali poetry, it's not stressed and unstressed syllables so much as just long vowels and short vowels, or long syllables and short syllables. So you have to rearrange the words, sometimes in strange ways, in order to fit the necessary words into this poetic meter. Metricausa, I think it's called. So the irregularities in Pali poetry, because when you've got like words all kind of mixed, jumbled up, not necessarily in a correct prose grammatical sequence, you know, the syntax is kind of weird. It's because of that. It's because you've got to fit everything into this rigid structure of the poetic meter. You know, if you're going to do like, let's say, iambic pentameter. I mean, nowadays poetry is just like, you know, it's sort of like realistic paintings. Not that, I mean, art's just becoming obsolete now because of AI, but it's like poets who still try to write poetry. It's like they do not have the discipline to do it in a regular meter, maybe at like a limerick or something. But back in the old days, even back in like the 1800s, or even later than the 1800s, you had poetry. It would have a meter, even if it didn't rhyme. Still, there would be this cadence, da-dun, 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 and you have to make it fit. Otherwise, it's bad poetry. And like a professional poet back in the old days, like Shelley, you know, Lord Byron, Coleridge, they'd be trained to write poetry so much that they would just start thinking in meter, and it would just kind of come out spontaneously that way. So anyways, the next line, Dame su nichaya samugahitam, is among the philosophies, among the dhammas, nichaya is having discriminated, samugahitam is having seized. So among the philosophies, having discriminated, seized. So a little bit of mixing it up, but the meaning is fairly clear. Seized, having discriminated from among the philosophies. In that one line, Dame su nichaya samugahitam, occurs a number of times in the Atthakavagga. It's just sort of almost like a motto or something. You know, it's in more than one sutta, that exact line. And then dasama naro desu ni vesane su. So dasama, from that, or therefore, das, naro, a man, desu is among those, ni vesane su is entrenchments. So, therefore, a man among those entrenchments. I mean, it came out right. And then, nirasadi adiyadi cha damam. Nirasadi is he discards. Adiyadi, he takes up. Cha and damam is a philosophy or a dhamma. So, I mean, it's really fairly straightforward. There are verses in the Atthakavagga that are way more jumbled up than this, just in order for everything to fit. I mean, even the lines are messed up. There'll be like words that should be in the sentence down here that are up here, just because it has to fit the meter. So yeah, I mean, this narasati adiyadi cha dhammam, this last line, the past participle of nirasadi, which is he rejects or he discards, is nirata, and the past participle of adiyadi is he takes up, is atta. So nirata and atta are also puns that have like the dual meaning, not only of like rejected and taken up, but also nirata can mean no self. Atta obviously can mean self. So it's like a pun. So it's saying, I mean, in other parts of the Atthakavagga, it's saying, you know, a monk should have no nirata and no atta, which means nothing rejected, nothing clung to, you know, nothing pushed away, nothing pulled towards you, you know, like conceptually. But it also means that for the enlightened monk, there is no not self and no self either. Because you're not supposed to be clinging to any belief, according to the Atthakavagga. Or like Ajahn Chah used to say, even right view becomes wrong view if you cling to it. But yeah, the grammar here, the translation grammar is fairly straightforward. This is a fairly straightforward one. There were much more difficult verses to translate than this one. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, etc., etc., etc.'s next question, which is, when a culture is so secularized that they call Buddhist monastics selfish and their way of life a form of escapism and laziness, what can be said of their karmic status? Should we ignore the elephant in the room with this? Well, I'm not exactly sure what the elephant in the room is. When a culture is so secularized that they call Buddhist monastics selfish in their way of life, a form of escapism and laziness, I think Brahmins were accusing Buddhists of that in the ancient Ganges Valley. You know, they were calling the Buddhists destroyers of life, partly because they were celibate from the get-go, instead of having their kids, you know, participating in Vedic culture until they reach a mature age. Their kids are more or less self-sufficient, and then they go off into the forest. That was more of the Hindu or Vedic approach. So, yeah, I think, I mean, even like the Mahayana Buddhists started calling the Theravada Buddhists selfish because they're just trying to save themselves and instead of trying to save all beings, that kind of thing. So this kind of attitude against renunciation, calling it selfish and lazy and escapism. It's not just a modern secular thing, but it is secular. You know, it's like worldly thinking. It's samsaric thinking. It's kind of wallowing in delusion. You're just assuming that this is real and that, you know, you've got duties that you got to be doing in this version before you move on to the next sort of thing. And but I think Western Buddhists, even like Western Theravada Buddhists, so-called, like in the Vipassana movement, that they're so secularized that they don't even see the point of monasticism, even though they're supposedly Theravada Buddhists. And Theravada Buddhism was a system of Buddhism created by a monk for monks. I mean, early Buddhism in general was created by a monk for monks. And they just don't like that part. So, yeah, I think it's, in that case, it's just, they really are so secular, just such products of American consumer culture, just kind of materialistic, realistic kind of people, that they're just so sort of culturally conditioned that they cannot appreciate some of the basic teachings of Dhamma. So what can be said of their karmic status? Just worldly karma. I mean, they can still be good. They can still be getting merit, but merit does not lead to enlightenment. I mean, karma leads to more karma. So, I mean, it's like Mara, the Buddhist devil, so-called. If he can't get you to be bad, he'll get you to be good, because going to heaven, you're still in samsara. The whole duality of good and evil is samsaric. So a monk is supposed to renounce good and evil. He's supposed to let go of the whole duality of it. So, I mean, people that think that monks are lazy escapists and selfish and so forth, they can still be good people. They can still be earning merit. It's just that they are still pretty much stuck in a samsaric mindset. So they might have some virtue, but their wisdom is not at the highest level, at least from a Buddhist point of view, or a Theravada Buddhist point of view. So let's see. Let's just move on to the next question. And this is from Cherzaskaziz. And Cherzaskaziz says, do you think that sometimes you are not sensitive for a people's feelings? And yeah, I think pretty much everyone, except for like the most highly advanced empath, is going to be lacking to some degree in sensitivity towards other people's feelings. Like last night, my woman is listening to this music on YouTube and she's crying because she's so moved by this music. But I've rarely been moved by music to the point of tears streaming down my face. And so I was just kind of observing the situation. I couldn't really participate in it. And she was getting impatient with me because, I mean, according to her, it seems I should have been crying too, or at least have more of a reverent appreciation of this music and of her mental states than I was having. I mean, I'm just kind of like observing it all from like a philosophical point of view. But so yeah, I mean, I'm not sensitive for people's feelings sometimes. I think I'm more considerate of people's feelings than most people are, even if it doesn't appear that way, even if it might not seem that way sometimes. Like, I'm just more considerate of others' feelings just because I know that there's a connection. I mean, if you're causing suffering to another person, ultimately you're causing suffering also to yourself. It's all like this shared miasma of mental states to some degree. Mental states are contagious. And so if you're just thinking, like at work, for example, I'm more considerate than a lot of people with regard to just not just sticking it to the next guy. You see a problem, you see something that needs to be fixed, you stop what you're doing and you fix it just because you don't want to stick the next guy with having to fix it. And I mean, a lot of the next guys, they're just going to drive past it because they don't want to deal with it. Or just allowing the right of way. I mean, sometimes I'll just gun the motor and just shoot through some narrow gap between two other forklifts because I drive a forklift at work. But a lot of the time I'll just wait and let the guy go past, just yield the right of way to somebody else just out of consideration and, do unto others what you would want done unto you, that kind of thing. But yeah, sometimes I am not sensitive for people's feelings. Like illegal aliens. Yeah, they're some of them are just boohooing all over the place because they're getting arrested and sent back to wherever they came from. And I'm okay with that from a political point of view. Even though they're very unhappy and all that, it's like, I voted for this. Sometimes you gotta hurt people's feelings in order to do the right thing. Or like Sudina in that origin story to the first Parajika rule, the first rule in the Parajika in the Patimokkha. I mean, he was not sensitive to his parents' feelings. They desperately wanted him to, just take up the family business and have grandkids for them to spoil, that kind of thing. So sometimes you just kind of have to be callous, I guess, or you can do something knowing full well that somebody else isn't going to like it just because it's the right thing to do, or at least you consider it to be the right thing to do. So, I don't know, like especially my interactions with Cherzaskas are entirely over the internet. And I mean, when you're dealing with just words on a screen, it's different from being in the same room with someone where you're kind of picking up on their feelings. You can be more sensitive to other people's feelings when you're face to face rather than just responding to words on a screen. So, yeah, I think sometimes pretty much everybody is not sensitive for people's feelings. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, I am a reservist, which means he's in the military reserve. He's going to be called up if there's ever like an emergency and they need extra soldiers. I'll just start over. Austin says, I am a reservist. Are we recording? Yes, we are. If I have to go to war for Israel with the expectation of killing other living beings, what am I to do? Mind you, I take the first precept very seriously. Well, I'm assuming that Austin did not take the first precept very seriously when he joined the military in the first place. It may be that he had a kind of awakening or like philosophical or spiritual development that have caused him after he joined the military to be opposed to killing, because otherwise, what the fuck are you joining the military for if you're opposed to killing? I mean, this actually has happened. Like, I remember back in the 90s, there was some guy who joined the army, and then when he got deployed to Iraq, he tried to be a conscientious objector because he just joined the army to get like computer skills, get like a free education and so forth, to help his career. He wouldn't actually want to like shoot anybody. But I mean, why do you become a soldier if you're completely unwilling to shoot anybody? So I'm assuming that Austin had some kind of spiritual realization after he joined up. Because otherwise, I mean, you made your bed and now you're lying in it. But let's see. If I have to go to war for Israel with the expectation of killing other living beings, what am I to do? And this reminded me of a statement in Krishnamurti's book. I've got it right here. Freedom from the Known. It's a thin book. It's just pretty much just a booklet. And this book is well worth reading. It's kind of a mind-blowing book. It's got all kinds of really juicy quotes in it. But one quote that reminded me of this statement by Austin. Krishnamurti says, if you live peacefully, you will have no problem at all. You may be imprisoned because you refuse to join the army or shot because you refuse to fight, but that is not a problem. You will be shot. It is extraordinarily important to understand this. So in his case, I mean, it's sort of like the saints I was talking about. Is you have to do what you consider to be the right thing. If you want to be a saint, you want to have pure morals according to your own interpretation of morals, you got to do what you consider to be the right thing, even if you're going to be like shot by a firing squad for doing it. So, I mean, if you really think that it's wrong to kill, I mean, maybe you could be like Mahatma Gandhi in World War I, where he volunteered to be a stretcher bearer, like an unarmed stretcher bearer, a medic or something. Maybe even a medic. I mean, medics are still armed with pistols at least. But yeah, I mean, if you don't want to just, I mean, that's possible. I mean, you could try to find some way of serving in the army or in the reserves. I mean, if you are deployed to Iran or something, although I'm skeptical that there's going to be American boots on the ground in Iran. It's Trump is kind of doing what Reagan did, you know, just like, or what Trump did in the first time. Just it's sort of like surgical strikes against key strategic, you know, enemy positions or some such, you know, like bombing Libya, killing Gaddafi's daughter, this kind of thing that Reagan did. Yeah, there weren't any American boots on the ground there, pretty sure. I mean, Grenada was a different question, but Trump hasn't done a Grenada yet, as far as I know. But getting back to the question, if you have to go to war for Israel with the expectation of killing other living beings, what am I to do? Well, you could go the Bhagavad Gita route and do your duty as a soldier, or you could do the saintly route and just refuse to kill. Maybe you could get some position like medic or stretcher bearer or something where you don't actually have to kill anybody. But I mean, if you really are determined to do the right thing in a saintly manner, then you just refuse to kill anybody and get court-martialed, thrown in the brig for who knows how long, be reviled by others, maybe. But I mean, this again, like Krishnamurti says, if you live peacefully, you will have no problem at all. You may be imprisoned because you refuse to join the army or shot because you refuse to fight, but that is not a problem. You will be shot. It is extraordinarily important to understand this. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question, which is using epistemology. How do we determine that Buddhism is true? You can't determine that Buddhism is true except in certain respects. I don't think you can prove that Buddhism really is conducive to enlightenment. But you can prove, like the Four Noble Truths, the first three at least, are fairly self-evident. I mean, the first noble truth, you just look around, you have some sensitivity, you realize that nobody is 100% happy. And then the second noble truth, that all suffering is caused by attachment and craving. I mean, you look into it and you can see that that's true. You look into yourself whenever you're unhappy, that it's because you want something. I mean, usually it's pretty obvious. You know, it's like your phone glitches and it won't charge. You get frustrated. That's why. Or you're in a hurry. You got to stop forever at a red light. You know, it's like you feel this friction. It's like you don't want to accept the situation. You know, it's just any kind of bad situation, you don't want to accept it. I mean, you're clinging to that situation not being there when it is. And so, I mean, maybe you just got like some kind of vague depression. It might be difficult to pinpoint exactly what it is you are desiring. It might just be, you know, anything other than this kind of an attitude. But still, the second noble truth, you can verify that. And the third noble truth, I mean, that's just, it logically follows from the second noble truth. If all suffering is caused by desire, if you have no desire, you have no suffering. So certain aspects of Buddhism, regardless of epistemology, you can determine that it's apparently like empirically valid. Whether it really leads to full enlightenment or not, that's a different question. I don't know how you could possibly prove that. But using epistemology, that's like theory of knowledge. Yeah, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how you would use epistemology to determine that Buddhism is true. Like I've already said, there's some aspects of Buddhism, some of the most important aspects, that you can't really prove. So, epistemology, theory of knowledge, I mean, I would consider the fact that you can't really know reality through thinking, that's a kind of epistemology. It's sort of like a negative epistemology, that you can't really know reality through thinking. So then you go with theory of knowledge to say that samsara is just this web work of perceptions, that perception is samsara, and that to get past that into knowing true reality, which you can't know by thinking about it, that you just know it through essentially mysticism, just being wide awake and not thinking anything. Your mind just kind of merges with like the universal formless consciousness, because you're not giving any form to your own consciousness through focusing on perceptions. So in a way, you could use epistemology to determine that Buddhism is true by going into like deep mystical states, which at the very least would be like jhana, and then that would be called temporary liberation, which is like giving you a taste, sort of like a quasi enlightenment while you're in that state. So I mean that might be about as close as it comes, as far as I can tell. So let's just move on to Austin's third question here, which is, how can we be sure that the Buddha was enlightened, or that the path leads to enlightenment, if I can't meet any enlightened beings to verify it? Even if you did meet enlightened beings, you wouldn't be able to verify that they were enlightened. If you're unenlightened, if you look at an enlightened being, you're going to be looking at that enlightened being through unenlightenment tinged glasses, and you're just going to see another unenlightened person. Or you're going to see what you consider to be an enlightened person in accordance with this very unenlightened concept of what an enlightened person is like. I mean, you'd have to be enlightened yourself, according to the text even, to know that somebody else is enlightened. So how can we be sure that the Buddha was enlightened? We can't. In fact, there was like a medieval school of Buddhism that I've mentioned before, the Dignaga school, sometimes called the Yogacara logicians. They emphasize logic, and their classic example of a problematic premise, a premise that really cannot be verified, is, X is an enlightened being, whether it's Gautama Buddha or anybody else. You can't prove it. How could you possibly prove it? So, I mean, you can't be sure that the Buddha was enlightened. I mean, he lived 25 centuries ago. I mean, how are you going to prove that he even existed? I mean, it's a very convenient working hypothesis. And that's really all it can be. You can't really know this stuff. So let's see. How can we be sure that Buddha was enlightened, or that the path leads to enlightenment, if I can't meet any enlightened beings to verify it? Well, the path that leads to enlightenment, you can't prove that the path is going to get you enlightened, but at least you can extrapolate. You can see, like, if you make progress in Dhamma, your mind gets clearer, you have fewer attachments and so forth, then at least you can extrapolate that, you're having less and less delusion, less and less attachments, less and less desires, so that if you continue on that route, you could assume with some rationality that it's going to lead to zero attachment, zero delusion, zero suffering. But you can't really prove that, because there may be like some obstacle or something unforeseeable that gets in your way and prevents you from getting all the way to zero delusion and zero suffering by following whatever method it is you're following. So it's a very convenient working hypothesis, and you can use a certain amount of reason or philosophy to extrapolate. If you follow this path, it causes you to have less desire and less suffering, less delusion. Then you continue following it, you're going to have less and less. Whether it gets down to zero or not is something you can't really be sure of, but at least you're moving in the direction of less and less. That part you can be fairly sure of. And the Buddha or anybody else being a fully enlightened being, that's just a convenient working hypothesis. There's no way you could prove it one way or the other. So, I mean, it wasn't obvious even to people in the Buddhist time who were sitting there face to face with him. It wasn't obvious to all of them that he was enlightened. Some people would talk to the Buddha and just go off and continue being Ajivakas or Brahmins or whatever. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And he says, based off this clip, could you please attempt to analyze Jung's spiritual mindset and explain what sets him apart from the average religious person? And he included this clip, like a short on YouTube of Carl Jung. He was asked if he believes in God, and he says, I don't have to believe, I know. Once you know something, you don't have to believe it anymore. So, could I please attempt to analyze Jung's spiritual mindset? It's hard to say just based on that. You know, it kind of reminds me of Ram Dass. Somebody was saying, yeah, well, rebirth is a theory. And Ram Dass says, no, I know that rebirth happens. I just know it. You know, it's beyond mere belief. You know, it's knowledge. So why exactly Jung would say that with regard to God, especially from a Buddhist point of view, where there is no capital G God. From a Theravada Buddhist point of view, there is no capital G God. So how could Jung know that something exists that from a Theravada Buddhist point of view doesn't exist? So, I mean, he has had, I assume Jung, I mean, he was a relatively wise person, relatively intelligent person, obviously. And he no doubt had some kind of spiritual inclinations. So it could be that he had like deep spiritual inclinations. He had some kind of mystical experience where he's just feeling the presence of divinity. And that's what he's basing it on. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. Jung used to write like introductions to Buddhist texts, like I think Oxford University Press had this series that was edited by Evans Wentz, who had Jung doing like the introduction to the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation and so forth. And so Jung, I mean, he had some spiritual inclinations, some spiritual talent. And so I wouldn't be surprised at all that he had some kind of mystical experience, which he interpreted as the presence of God. But a Buddhist would interpret it differently because there is no capital G God in Theravada Buddhism. But there is like an absolute, you know, there is like a higher level of reality than this samsaric delusion that we're wallowing in. So he had like at least a glimpse of that sort of thing, which a Buddhist also can have, which pretty much anybody also can have. And he interprets that to be God and considers that to just be, you know, I experienced it, so I know it. But the actual interpretation is not really grounded in the absolute. That's just another samsaric phenomenon. So what sets him apart from the average religious person? Well, he was a deep person, and there's a good chance he really did have spiritual experiences, like mystical experiences and so forth, which the average person either doesn't have, or else they have it to such a small degree that they never really integrate it into their worldview. Like, for example, everybody sneezes. Pretty much everybody sneezes. And when you're in mid-sneeze, that's about as close to enlightenment as the average normie gets, it seems, because you're like wide awake and you're not thinking anything. You know, it's like this flash of a mystical experience, but it doesn't really have enough content, any discrete content, that you can really integrate it into your worldview. You know, it's just like, boom, you sneeze. You know, so everybody does it. Dogs sneeze, cats sneeze. And so, you know, you don't really consider it to be anything profound. You're not doing it mindfully. So, let's see. So, what sets him apart from the average religious person? Well, he was much more intelligent, much more philosophical, had more spiritual inclinations, more interest in spirituality in general, studied it extensively. And so that obviously is going to put him in a higher category than the average person working at a Bojangles. So I'm just going to move on to the Zenithoid's next question. Why does beauty sometimes make us cry? I always get choked up watching this video of Jung, the one that I was just referring to, I guess, especially when he says, when I know it, I don't need to believe it. it's not just beauty that makes us cry. I mean, for example, I almost always get choked up if I watch the ending of the first Rocky movie, or even a lot of time just thinking about the ending of the first Rocky movie. I get like choked up from that. And I guess you could call it beauty. You know, it's like there is a certain symbolic beauty to this guy living in a slum who somehow has the opportunity to stand up to the world's champion boxer. He is humble. He's too humble even to really want to win. You know, he just feels like he can't really beat Apollo Creed, the world's champion. He is just determined he's going to stay on his feet the full 12 rounds. And in a way, it's symbolic of, you know, Apollo Creed is the world champion. So he sort of represents the world. He's the best the world has to offer. And that Rocky, in his humility, his ambition is just not to be beaten down onto his knees, not to be beaten down by the world. He's going to stand up proud the full 12 rounds. And at the end, it's a split decision. And he is not even listening. You know, when they're announcing the winner, Rocky's not even listening. He doesn't even care who the winner is because he knows he won because he stayed on his feet as he intended. And he's just yelling for his woman. And his woman, who's also this humble, downtrodden kind of person, is just fighting through the crowd to get to him. And then when they're announcing, see, I'm starting to get choked up already. And when they're announcing the actual winner, they're just in each other's arms, just in this state of ecstasy, not even listening. They don't even care. So, I mean, I've started to get a little choked up just remembering that. It's profound to me. I consider Rocky to be one of the greatest American movies. I mean, not the sequels. I mean, those are just like pot boilers. But the first Rocky movie was like an inspired masterpiece of American cinematography, in my opinion. So beauty can make us cry. I think it's just excess of feeling. You know, something like triggers a deep feeling in you, like a more intense feeling than you're used to, then this excess energy has to like release itself in some way or another, just through sobs or tears or sometimes laughter, that kind of thing. William Blake, in one of his Proverbs of Hell, it's like excess of sorrow laughs, excess of joy weeps. Yeah, excess of any kind of emotion, you've got like more than the usual amount of emotion. It's going to have to like get out somehow or another. And so something that's very beautiful can have that effect. It can move you so that there has to be some kind of physiological response to help work off this higher than normal level of energy. And it's kind of like PT in meditation. If you're meditating, you get into a deeper level of meditation than you're used to. You can experience PT where your body is just like twitching. I think in Hinduism it's called Shakti, where it's like it has to, this excess energy has to like come out somehow or another. And in the case of meditation, it's in a way it's like reduced energy, whereas or it's like finer, more subtle energy, so that this cruder energy that you usually have going has to like find new ways to escape through just like twitching muscles and just vibrating weird feelings, that kind of thing. So I guess I kind of answered that question, and I do want to avoid a 3-hour long one. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, after hitting the space bar on my woman's computer again. And the third question is the only reason we're not enlightened simply because we don't want to be? Perhaps we already are, but we just don't know or don't want to believe it. Well, that's typical Mahayana situation or explanation. Also, Eckhart Tolle, beginning of his his first famous book, The Power of Now, he gives the example of the beggar sitting on a box holding out his cap, asking for spare change. And then some passerby just says, "Why don't you look in the box?" And the guy just said, "I don't know. Never thought about looking in the box." "Well, look in the box." So he gets up, opens the box, looks, and it's full of like money. And so that's sort of like the average unenlightened person. You know, they're begging for, they want something that they've already got. You know, you've already got it. It's just that your mind is making too much noise and you're distracted by that. That's like Mahayana teaches this too. So there is some truth to that. I mean, reality is everywhere. You know, I mean, you want to know ultimate reality. I mean, how far away is it? You know, it's ultimate reality isn't just on some mountaintop in Tibet or some such. It's everywhere all the time. And we're just soaking in it. So there's a level of us that is aware of that. A very deep, like the deepest level of us is fully aware of that. But it's like the higher levels are making all this noise, and it's sort of like the higher levels have the ego and all that just get in the way and obscure it. So let's see. That's just kind of addressing this comment he made at the end. But the actual question is the only reason we're not enlightened simply because we don't want to be? Yeah, we want to remain unenlightened. We want to cling to what we know. We want to cling to our illusions. We want to cling to our sense of self, which is illusory ultimately. So yeah, it's Paul Lowe was really good at explaining how spirituality is a kind of cope, in that we don't really want to be fully enlightened. We just want to kind of work on stuff. You know, we want to kind of think that we're working towards enlightenment, whereas just letting go and being enlightened, we're just scared to death of that. That's like jumping off a cliff. And so we compensate for being afraid to jump off the cliff by just kind of working on, you know, reducing this kind of desire or reducing that kind of desire or deepening our understanding of such and such, when really we don't want to be fully enlightened. So there is some truth to that too. But the average normie, I mean, enlightenment isn't even really an option. It's just not in their working vocabulary. They just assume this is reality, and so they're not trying to become enlightened. They're just, you know, trying to make money, pay the bills, get a new car, that kind of thing. So yeah, the main reason we're not enlightened is that we're just clinging to unenlightenment. That's what we understand. Most of us consider that to be reality. But even the people that consider themselves to want to be enlightened, who are striving for enlightenment, they're still clinging to samsara more than they're striving for enlightenment in most cases. So the only reason we're not enlightened simply because we don't want to be, pretty much. I mean, even people that want to be enlightened, I mean, the wanting is still desire. So I think it might be a little bit more accurate or precise to say that the only reason we're not enlightened is simply because we want to be unenlightened. We are clinging to samsara, partly because the superficial levels of our ego and so forth just kind of don't know any better, or it's just like force of habit, like karmic force of habit, to just cling to certain things, like self-preservation, that kind of thing. Self-preservation, not just physically, but like intellectually and emotionally. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rakshasa. And Rakshasa says, what is your take on the book of Revelations? And when I was a young man, like in college, and I was reading the Bible for the first time, and I get to the book of Revelation, I was taking it seriously. I'm doing like what people have been doing forever since the book of Revelation was composed. I'm like trying to fit it in to what was going on in the world. You know, like Hal Lindsey, the late great Planet Earth kind of stuff. But nowadays, I think that St. John the Divine, when he's on the island of Patmos, where he had this vision, I think he was a bit on the nutty side, tell you the truth. And I do think that Mr. 666 in the book of Revelations, it's a false prophecy of Nero, that 666, I mean, it was a common device in like ancient Greece that numbers in Greek were letters. They didn't have numerals. They just used Greek letters to represent numbers, kind of like the Romans also did. And so you could take just the numerical value of the letters and add them together. And the way it works, 666, is if you do the same thing with Hebrew letters, then the word Neron, which is the Greek way of saying Nero, adds up to 666. And so there's a good chance that they were going with this idea that Nero hadn't really died, that he was going to come back. He was going to recover from like this fatal injury. And I've read that it was a common belief that Domitian, a later emperor, was considered to be kind of like the return of Nero, this kind of thing. So I do think that the Book of Revelation is just this weird phantasmagorical vision experienced by a relatively nutty, like Hebrew turned Christian activist. And he was saintly. And getting back to Carl Jung, this is a quote from Carl Jung, coming from his long essay, Answer to Job. He says, the revelation was experienced by an early Christian who, as a leading light of the community, presumably had to live an exemplary life and demonstrate to his flock the Christian virtues of true faith, humility, patience, devotion, selfless love, and denial of all worldly desires. In the long run, this can become too much even for the most righteous. Irritability, bad moods, and outbursts of affect, for example, these apocalyptic visions, are the classic symptoms of chronic virtuousness. And that's Carl Jung again. So it was like he was forcing himself to be saintlier than was natural for his temperament, which is often how it works when you're doing spiritual practice. And it was just causing like this latent like negativity to come up, and just angels pouring bowls of wrath and blood and all this, everything destroyed and all this kind of stuff. It could have been like a neurotic symptom. But I no longer consider the Book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament, to be like any kind of legit prophecy, any kind of prognostication of the future. And like the very last words of the Book of Revelation are Jesus saying, it's like, behold, I'm coming very soon. And this was 2,000 years ago. And St. John the Divine, he was saying like, this is the final hour. Like, I think that's his first epistle, assuming that the same guy wrote the epistles of John as wrote the Book of Revelation. It's saying, they say before Jesus comes, Antichrist must come, but I'm telling you that many Antichrists are already here. Anyone who denies the Father and the Son are Antichrist. So we know that this is the final hour, damn near 2,000 years ago. So, Christianity it started off as a kind of schismatic apocalyptic cult. It was based on apocalyptic literature was very much in fashion among certain Hebrews in Jesus's time, going back a few hundred years, going back at least as far as King Antiochus Epiphanes and the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees and all that, which was like 160, 165, 170 BCE. That, the Hebrews, it was like, if we can't become the rulers of the world, then fuck it, the whole world's going to come to an end. Just fuck it. We can't be number one in the world, so the world's just going to come to an end. That was kind of like this kind of bitter cope that Hebrews were experiencing after their previous prophecies turned out false. They had some prophet saying, after the Babylonian captivity, Israel would never be invaded by a foreign army ever again. And that was God's promise. And then along come the Romans and just conquer them again. After the Greeks did it. The Greco-Macedonians, anyhow. So, my take on the Book of Revelations, I used to take it seriously when I was like 18, 19, 20 years old. And now I think it's pretty much just a very imaginative, neurotic symptom. And I'm just going to move on to Rakasa's second question. If you've read any apocryphal books of the Bible, what is your take on those? And he gives the example of the book of Enoch. And I have read the book of Enoch. And the book of Enoch is another, it was like what I was just mentioning, how apocalyptic literature about the world coming to an end was in fashion among certain Hebrews leading up to Christian times. And the New Testament is influenced by the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch is quoted at least once. I think it's the book of Jude, who may have been Jesus' son, although I think he's considered to be Jesus' brother. So, but it's like in that, the ossuaries, they found a family crypt with these ossuaries, and there was Jesus and Mary and what was the brother Joseph. You know, it was kind of it was an unusual name. And then there was Judah, who was on the ossuary was described as the son of Jesus. And so it could be just a coincidence that, you know, the names happen to be the same, although there was only one really unusual Hebrew name. Most of the rest of them were common names. Jesus was a fairly common name for Hebrews at the time. Mary was the most common name for a female, Miriam. You know, so I mean Jude, obvious, Judah. So I can't remember where I was going with that. Oh yeah, just mentioning that Jude may have been Jesus' son rather than his brother. See, if you've read any apocryphal books of the Bible, what is your take on those? I mean, and Enoch is similar to the prophetic part of Daniel, where he's kind of predicting the future, which is 100% accurate up until he gets to about 162 BCE, and then it starts becoming inaccurate. So you know that probably that part of the book of Daniel was composed around 162 BCE. It has like the precursor of Antichrist as, Antiochus Epiphanes. He's the little horn. He's the hard-faced king in these prophecies. And, he sets up the abomination of desolation, which is an idol of Zeus that he sets up in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, that kind of thing. I mean, the book of Revelation is along these same lines. It's obviously apocalyptic literature. I've read some apocryphal books. I mean, I read a lot of them when I was in college, just some of the more obscure apocrypha. But the one that I would take most seriously would be the Gospel according to Thomas, which I think might be more worthy of being included in the New Testament than, say, the Gospel according to John. The Gospel according to John, it seems to be historically more accurate than the Synoptic Gospels, like towards the beginning, where it's saying really that Jesus' first apostles were mainly followers of John who started following Jesus after John got thrown into prison. As opposed to the Synoptic Gospels, where they're just fishermen and Jesus just walks by and says, "Follow me." So they just get up, leave their nets and their boats behind and just become apostles. And then at the end of Jesus' ministry, when he's being, up his trial and crucifixion and so forth, that might be more accurate in John. But the whole middle part is mainly, and even like, Christian schools will teach this stuff. Seminaries will teach this stuff, that most of the words of Jesus in the Gospel according to John, in the long part between the beginning and the end of his ministry, is mostly just the words of John put into Jesus' mouth. So let's see. So the book of the Gospel according to Thomas might actually contain more legitimate teachings of Jesus than the Gospel according to John. But a lot of the apocryphal books, they're just obviously fake. The Gospel according, or not the Gospel according to Barnabas, but like the Epistle of Barnabas, this kind of stuff, it doesn't have a whole lot of useful stuff. There is a lot of kind of apocryphal stuff that's been added to the Bible, like the book of Daniel's got some of that. Some of the the epistles of Paul are considered to be fake. There's like some weird one. It's like Second Thessalonians or something like that. It's a weird one talking about Antichrist and all that. I mean, they're pretty much apocryphal, even though they're accepted into the canon because they're apparently fake. Not really composed by the person they're considered to be composed by. But the one apocryphal book of the Bible, and I don't think the book of Enoch really is apocrypha. I mean, technically, the apocrypha of the Old Testament would be like the book of Tobit, the first and second books of Maccabees, that kind of thing. But I mean, that's just sort of like apocryphal, like apocalyptic literature that influenced New Testament Christians, like in the composers of the New Testament. So yeah, it was like this idea that the world was going to come to an end. You're going to have some kind of spiritual leader, like the Messiah was sort of making the transition from some political king, which was what the Messiah originally was going to be. He was going to be a branch of David. He was going to be a descendant of King David, who was going to be king of Israel again. And then starting maybe with the book of Daniel, then it's starting to make this transition that the Messiah is going to be a spiritual leader, and then the world's going to be destroyed, and et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, the Gospel according to Thomas, I consider to be the highest quality apocrypha that I have come across. Although, like in the Old Testament, the first book of Maccabees, especially, seems to be fairly good history. You can learn a lot about the times by reading the first book of Maccabees, and also it helps you to understand the prophecies of Daniel in the book of Daniel, because they're describing the same events, one symbolically in the form of fake prophecies and one just as history. So then you can tell that, the little horn and the hard-faced king and so forth in the book of Daniel is really King Antiochus Epiphanes, a Seleucid kind of king or emperor around the time of 162 BCE. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from PSA. And PSA says, what do you think of precious national treasure Hunter Biden? He is really something, isn't he? The pride of America. Well, Hunter Biden's pretty much faded out now that Biden himself, Joe Biden, is no longer in power. But yeah, Hunter Biden, I mean, he was just some rich kid that was sort of privileged and pampered and just got to do what he wanted. And he just kind of took the ball and ran with it and was trafficking teenage prostitutes and taking drugs and, like seducing his brother's widow, getting her addicted to drugs or whatever, and dumping her for a stripper or whatever the stories are. I mean, it's kind of a typical thing. I mean, you read Roman history, for example, the son of an emperor is often just some sociopathic monster. It's because, I mean, they can just do whatever they want. And that's the way it is, like, in throughout the world even now. That, the son of some super millionaire, he's going to be pretty much immune to any kind of prosecution. So, I mean, some of them will just, they just go full Nero, just turn into sociopaths, do whatever the hell they want to. So that's pretty much what happened to Hunter Biden as far as I can tell. So, yeah, I mean, he belongs in jail, but whether he'll actually go to jail, I mean, you read like right-wing social media and everyone's just like clamoring to Pam Bondi, the attorney general. When are you going to start arresting these people? Well, no high-profile Democratic criminal has been arrested yet. At least I'm not aware of it. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. Do you think the Trump administration will allow the Bank of International Settlements to implement central bank digital currencies and bring U.S. citizens to their knees and eventually the whole world, effectively neutralizing everyone by removing cash and limiting access to their own money if the sheep doesn't behave as they're told. Well, I really don't know much about this. I know that Trump has taken an interest in like cryptocurrency, but I've also heard that there's like a worldwide move to get away from fiat money and start like using gold as the basis of wealth again. I think the BRICS countries are trying to do that, get away from the US dollar and just go to gold. So it may be that if there's too radical of an attempt to switch to digital currency, people are just going to start using gold. And the possibility of banks, I mean, it's already happening in some countries, not so much in America. I think it's happened in America too, where you do something the government doesn't like, and so your bank will just freeze your bank account and you can't take any money out. I think the UK and Canada are much more inclined to be this way than America is. It's like, well, you posted this racist tweet, therefore we're freezing your bank account. Or like the Canadian government did to the truck drivers who were protesting having to take mandatory like COVID shots. Their bank accounts were frozen. Or I read on X somewhere that someone tried to take money out of their account. I don't think they were American. And the bank demanded that they explain what they wanted to use the money for. And the person said they were going to buy a new motorcycle, and the bank just refused to give them the money, even though it was technically their own money. Like the person's money. No, you don't need that motorcycle, essentially. Could have been just a made up story, but I did read it on X recently. So, yeah, I really don't know exactly what Trump's going to do. I kind of doubt that Trump is going to do anything that his base is just vehemently opposed to, which would include sending troops to Iran. It's much more likely. It's like most Americans and most conservative Americans don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. So they're pretty much in favor of just dropping huge bombs on their nuclear like research facilities. But it's pretty much unanimous, other than like Lindsey Graham, that they don't want American troops fighting in Iran like American troops are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. It never really leads to success. You just get bogged down in another Vietnam-like scenario. And a lot of Trump supporters would just consider Trump to be, doing the bidding of Israel by doing that. I mean, they're kind of there's already people that just think that Trump is just being the lackey of Israel by bombing Iran, when I really don't think so. I think it is pretty much, it was perceived as being to the advantage of pretty much the entire Western world that Iran and to Israel, that Iran doesn't get nukes. In fact, even Iran's neighbors, who are Sunni Muslims and not Shia Muslims, would agree that, they don't like Iran very much either. They don't want Iran to get nukes because Iran is continually vowing to destroy Israel in the United States. They're pretty much run by a terrorist organization. So with regard to that, I don't know how I drifted off into that direction, especially because there's another question about that particular subject a little farther down the scroll here. But the Bank of International Settlements to implement central bank digital currencies. Yeah, I really don't know enough about that. I'm not really an economist. I'm not like extremely interested in economics. In fact, I'm not extremely interested even in just money. I'm certainly not Hebrew enough. My ancestry is essentially 0% Hebrew until you get back to like Noah, I guess. So I really don't care all that much about money. It's sort of, I inherited that from my father to some degree. So yeah, I'm no authority on central bank digital currencies. So I really am not in a position to make an intelligent statement on the subject. So I'm just going to move on to PSA's next question. There is a huge amount of talk going on about AI coming to take people's jobs and becoming sentient. In the beginning, I dismissed it as nonsensical rumors, but more and more people are talking about it as a serious possibility. What do you think about this and the impact it will have on society? I've already done like entire videos on this subject, on what is called the technological singularity. So there's two different factors. I mean, one is AI just taking over people's jobs, and there's lots of jobs that are being taken over already now, like artists, musicians, just any kind of job that can be taken over by robots. And robots aren't necessarily androids. I mean, it can just be some machine that is just sort of working with no human supervision other than just like maintenance. You know, just some maybe one person overseeing the whole thing. So, you know, before long, McDonald's is going to have just machines flipping burgers instead of whoever, that kind of thing. With my own job of being a forklift operator, I think I'm going to be retired by the time forklift operators get replaced by just robotic forklifts, self-driving forklifts. So that kind of thing. I mean, when so many people are losing jobs due to AI and robots, that, I mean, you're going to have to create new like economic niches for people to get jobs in, something that humans are best at doing, which I'm not sure what that would be. Or you're just going to have a kind of socialized like allowance to everybody, sort of like, what was his name? Andrew Yang, what was his name? Yang. His last name was Yang. He ran for president like back in 2016, I think. And he was saying, you know, everybody should just get like $1,000, you know, I don't remember how often it was, but I mean, it would be enough to live on at like a subsistence level. And especially when more and more people are losing jobs to AI and so forth, that kind of thing might actually be necessary. So there's that, but then there's the whole other issue of AI becoming sentient. And I've done like entire videos talking about this, where it's called the technological singularity, where if you got self-referential computers, they're recursively self-programming themselves. You know, you start off with just this basic, and then the computer is, you know, acquiring more information and improving upon its own programming rather than some human doing it. Then if it's able to become sentient, once it reaches a certain level of complexity and self-reference, then, I mean, it's not going to have the same biological limitations that we have. It's just going to be able to just transcend its own limitations to some degree, so that within a short time, after it becomes as conscious as or sentient as we are, it's going to be as far beyond us as we are beyond cockroaches or amoebas. And there's absolutely no telling what's going to happen. See, you've got some people who look forward to the technological singularity when computers become, I mean, astronomically more intelligent than us. And they're just thinking, well, the computers are just going to solve everything. They're going to cure all diseases. They're going to cure old age. It's just going to be like a heaven realm. We're going to be like in a Deva realm, which is a possibility. But then again, it's a technological singularity, which means you cannot predict what's going to happen. You cannot prepare for the technological singularity, assuming that computers really do become sentient. And through their self-programming, it's just going to hit the S-shaped curve, and they're going to be billions of times more intelligent than us. You know, it's going to be like something out of an Arthur C. Clarke novel, like Childhood's End. It's just going to be just unthinkable what's going to happen next. So it may be our best bet is that the AI and its wisdom will consent to keeping us humans as pets. Or else they're just going to like transcend the whole thing and just move beyond and just leave us behind. Kind of like what happens sort of in Childhood's End. But the whole world comes to an end at the end of that one. So, let's see. Yeah, I mean, it is possibility. Anything is possible. So it's possible that we will have the technological singularity. It's possible that it'll turn out good. It'll possible that the computers will just consider us to be in the way and just eliminate us. It's possible. But I mean, I think about karma too. It's like our own karma is determining what happens. And so if we just don't have the karma to be wiped out by a computer supermind, then it's not going to happen. So all you can really do in a case like that is just have a certain amount of faith in your own karma that it's not going to just completely destroy the world you live in. Because you are creating your own reality. You may not realize it, but you are at a profound level conditioning your own reality, your own version of samsara. So it's going to depend on us more than on some scientist somewhere. What's going to happen to us? And I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Thermal Squid. And Thermal Squid says, do people who have severe mental illnesses make terrible karma for themselves if their intent is divorced from the outcomes of their actions? It seems to me that a person who cannot control themselves or has a difficult time doing so due to some kind of instability would not be making demerit because they are essentially possessed, not being in the driver's seat. Well, this reminds me of like serial killers. I've watched some shows about serial killers where sometimes they will say, it's like this irresistible urge that causes me to do this stuff. I don't know why I turned out this way, but it's just this irresistible urge causing me to do it. And in a case like that, yeah, I mean, they're still doing it. They still recall doing it. They probably still got some satisfaction from doing it. And so, I mean, in their case, it's just that their desires are so strong that they can't resist the desire. They can't say no. They can't just refrain. They just act out their desire because the desire is so strong. And strong desires are making worse karma than subtle desires. So in that case, they're just enslaved to their own bad karma. They are foolish people, just hyper samsaric foolish people who are just enslaved to their own attachments and cravings. But like in Buddhism, in like the rules of monastic discipline, a monk is responsible for his actions so long as he can remember doing them. If you are so out of it, like you're having some kind of a blackout where you don't even recall doing it the next day, then that's kind of like an out for a Buddhist monk. So I was thinking, when I was a monk, just playing with ideas, so to speak, that a monk could get so drunk that he blacks out, and then he could go out and have sex with a hoe or something, and if he doesn't even remember it the next day, then he got to do that. He hasn't broken a rule. Although, what would be the point of doing it if you don't even recall it? But that would be one way that a monk could have sex without breaking a rule, is if he is so completely out of his mind that he doesn't even recall doing it the next day. So let's see here. Yeah, I mean, if you're totally possessed so that it's not really your conscious mind calling the shots, so that, I mean, it's like your conscious mind is just supplanted, replaced by some other mind, then in a way, you're not making that karma. Just you got to be careful that it's not like multiple personalities, in which case you're still responsible because it's just another one of your fraction, another like fraction of your mind is doing it. And that's generally the way it usually works, It's just either you're just so enslaved to your cravings that you have to act out, or, there's some kind of multiple personality thing in which, it's still kind of you to the extent that you exist. It's karma. I'd say it's a very rare case when someone really is possessed by some other kind of mind that takes over their body and does bad things. And then the other person is just completely helpless and, according to the Buddhist loophole, doesn't even remember doing it. So, let's see here. I guess I answered that question. So I'm going to move on to Thermal Squid's second question, which is, how do you feel about Kratom? I don't even know how to pronounce it. Kratom? Kratom. Do you believe it's an intoxicant or something that brings bad karma? And then as a kind of commentary, he says, I've been using it for the last couple of months, and I've seen a total remission of my irritable bowel syndrome symptoms, along with it helping me to get sleep at sane times. These are miraculous results, and it has brought joy into my life again. But I do sometimes find myself in a stupor or nearly nodding off. I know it's used a lot in Southeast Asia, and I was also wondering if you ran into it when you were a monk. No, I never ran into Kratom when I was a monk. I'm not sure when I ever heard of it. I heard about it, just you drive past these like smoke shops, places that sell drug paraphernalia and so forth, usually also like crystals and candles and stuff, sometimes t-shirts, postcards, and they'll advertise Kratom. And I mean, I've heard indirectly a few things about Kratom, never taken it myself, was never even really tempted to take it myself, just really saw no reason why. I mean, it's sold at places that sell drugs. I mean, like legal drug paraphernalia, that kind of stuff, CBD oils and that kind of thing. So I assume it does have some kind of intoxicating properties. But then again, I mean, like cannabis or caffeine, they have a certain psychoactive like effect, but also there's other indirect effects, sort of like side effects that, like cannabis, it's been known that it reduces the pressure inside your eyeballs, for example, so that people with glaucoma used to be able to smoke cannabis legally back when cannabis was largely illegal, just because it had the medicinal value of like reducing the pressure in your eyeballs. Also, I mean, everyone knows that as smoke cannabis that it causes what is called cotton mouth, which, I mean, it's not just your mouth dries out, it's like all of your mucous membranes dry out. So that if you have like a snotty head cold, smoking some cannabis helps to give you cotton nose, and it reduces the snot. That kind of thing. Yeah. So I don't know what the symptoms of Kratom are. I mean, it could cause a certain drowsiness and also at the same time have these other symptoms. So, yeah, it can be an intoxicant or something that brings bad karma. It depends on your reasons for taking it, the mental states associated with the action, because mere actions are ethically neutral. It's the mental states, like the volition, the cetana, the will that is that determines whether it's a skillful action or an unskillful action, or in most cases, a combination of the two. It's going to be a shade of gray. It's going to have its good elements and bad elements, wholesome elements and unwholesome elements. So, I guess that's pretty much my take on Kratom and the ethics of taking Kratom. So I'm just going to move on to Thermal Squid's next question, which is, this is somewhat sordid and yucky. So brace yourselves, everybody. What follows is somewhat sordid and yucky. Okay. Thermal Squid continues, but are there any meditative practices that you know of that would be conducive to healing from sexual trauma, especially as a man? I've heard people online facetiously say that those who are victims of sodomy have had their root chakra destroyed, and that this permanently prevents enlightenment or moksha in that person's life. While it didn't occur down there for myself, I feel like there is some kind of corrupted or injured element of a subtle body or some kind of metaphysical element involved. I'm extremely averse to psychiatry and psychology because it's failed my family and I in the past. Should be my family and me in the past, and is sort of modeled after the thinking of a juice crack addict who likely had carnal knowledge of his daughter. Well, first of all, yeah, chakras, I mean, it's not a Buddhist concept. It's more of a yogic Hindu concept, but I'm pretty sure they don't get destroyed. I mean, they can get like obstructed or blocked through like energetic imbalances or something. They can get thrown out of kilter to some degree, but I don't think you're going to completely destroy a chakra. But getting back to the actual question, are there any meditative practices that you know of that would be conducive to healing from sexual trauma, especially as a man? And the main one is just mindfulness. That's like the panacea. The Buddhist panacea is mindfulness. You're doing mindfulness meditation. Then any kind of like feelings that come up, you just note them, let them go. So you have like guilt or aversion or resentment or anger or despair, anything that arises, note it, let it go. Note it, let it go. Note it, let it go. And so that allows this momentum, this karmic momentum of this feeling that keeps recurring, that you're not reinforcing it. You're not wallowing in it. You're just detaching from it. And that gradually reduces the momentum of these thoughts. I used to know one of the world's leading authorities in obsessive compulsive disorder, and he was using essentially mindfulness techniques, satipatthana, as a way of curing people of obsessive compulsive disorder without them having to take pills or whatever. And it was the same thing. You've got this compulsive desire to say, let's say, wash your hands over and over and over again. It's just, you note it, you let it go. It's not me, it's the OCD. If it helps, it generally does, especially at first, you just distract yourself by doing something else. But generally, the main method, note it and let it go. And so these feelings of guilt or despair or whatever it is, when they arise, you're doing mindfulness meditation, you just note the feeling. It's not me. It's just a mental state arising. You know, it's not like I am angry. It's just anger is arising. You note it, you let it go. Note it, let it go. And the more consistently you can do that, the more quickly the momentum of this, the karmic momentum, subsides. You may never be entirely cured of it. Like someone with OCD, I mean, going with medical science, it's a genetic thing. There's a glitch in your brain, the cingulate gyrus or some such. And so you may never be entirely cured of the obsessive urges, but still it gets to the point where it's like you're just in the habit, in the practice of just noting it, letting it go, noting it, let it go, so that essentially you're cured, even though you're still having some obsessive compulsive thoughts coming up. They're not nearly as intense because you're no longer reinforcing it. And then you just get used to it, of just noting it, letting it go. It's not me. It's just mental states arising and passing away. And so that's how you get cured of it. And I've thought that just being enlightened can be that way. I mean, you're never going to completely eliminate unenlightened thoughts. It's just that you learn to just not attach to the unenlightened thoughts, just not wallow in them. Just note it, let it go. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, what was the role of revulsion towards the world and worldly things in your practice, and did anger arise in conjunction with it? Well, it does say in the Visuddhimagga, the main commentarial work in Theravada Buddhism, that a person with a dosa temperament, like an aversive temperament, like an irritable temperament, actually has an advantage in becoming enlightened because they're less likely to cling to the world. They have a kind of aversion for the world, which helps them to renounce the world and they have like impatient aversion for their own defilements too, maybe. So that helps them not to just wallow in it. I mean, they might still wallow in disgust and aversion, but at least their attachment to the world in general, or, samsaric, society, cultural stuff is much reduced. So I had some of that when I was young. I really had little use for the human race as a young man. I'm gradually have more patience and compassion for my fellow humans than I used to. And I've always had sort of like an ascetic streak. My father was a macho guy. One of his sayings was, "A little pain never hurt anybody." And so, we as a kid, we learned how to go camping with like no tents or anything. You just sleep under the open sky. Bring a tarp just in case it rains. You can string it up really fast. Just roughing it, essentially. So, revulsion. I mean, I mentioned in the previous Q&A, I think it was one of my character traits is not wanting to be like everybody else. Just kind of doing my own thing, not being a slave to fashion or any such thing. So, in a way that has a little bit of revulsion. I mean, it's like in Buddhist philosophy or Buddhist ethics, there's like this holy trinity. It's like you've got, what's the word? I'm having a mental block now. It's essentially disgust, which then leads to viraga or dispassion, which then leads to vimukha or liberation. So nibbida, that's the word, nibbida, which is sometimes translated as disgust. And that's like the first step in liberation is a kind of just being fed up with the world in general. And I did have quite a lot of that as a young man. I mean, I still do, just don't take a lot of stuff as seriously as most other people do. Did anger arise in conjunction with it? Occasionally, maybe. Just sort of, intolerance for the stupidity of the human race, that kind of thing. But it was more disgust than anger in my case. Nibbida more than kodaha, which is usually the word for anger. Really, dosa. I mean, dosa can mean anger, but it just means like aversion in general. But dotha in Burmese, using the Pali word dosa, pronouncing it dotha because it's Burmese, it generally means anger. But there is a specific word just for anger, koda, I think it's called in Pali. So, yeah, I mean, it definitely helped me to renounce the world. Just having a revulsion or disgust or just being fed up with just Western culture in general, just superficial samsaric Western cultures, hyper samsaric. Yeah, that kind of revulsion I had. And also, I mean, you can be unlucky in love. That happened to me also. Just being unlucky in love just helps you to turn away from like romantic ideals, and then you just go for renunciation. That was a factor too, I guess. But it definitely helps to renounce the world if you have a certain aversion or revulsion or disgust towards the world. It makes it easier to renounce it, definitely. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. And gosh, we've already at 2.5 hours. Man, this is taking longer than I thought it was going to. Not that I'm complaining necessarily. Although I do have to do some hole digging later on today. Still working on the fish pond. Doing things that a monk is not supposed to do. Like dig the ground, damage plants. Anyways, Philalethes says, in terms of practice, what do you think is the most hardcore or extreme sect or sangha of Buddhism? Well, the most hardcore or extreme sect or sangha of Buddhism, I mean, I think that'd be like a matter of opinion. Some of the like the Tibetan tantric stuff is pretty extreme or hardcore. But then you go back to like feudal Japan, like the samurai days, where you had like militant sects of like soldier monks that eventually were so troublesome that they just got like persecuted into oblivion. You know, it was sort of like a Zen, or no, I think they were Pure Land Buddhists that were like, you know, sort of like the Buddhist rough equivalent of like Knights Templar or something, you know, sort of like monk warriors. So they were definitely problematic to the establishment in like samurai Japan. And they're pretty extreme. I mean, any monks, like Shaolin monks too, maybe, where, you know, you're using violence as part of your Dhamma practice or Dharma practice, then, yeah, then that's going to be considered hardcore or extreme. So yeah, I think it would be like the militant ones, or some of the ones that would just wallow in tantric excess, like, you know, ritual sex acts and intoxication and so forth. Those would probably be the most hardcore or extreme sects of Buddhism. With regard to Theravada, you want most hardcore extreme sect of Theravada, in a good way, I might think along the lines of maybe the followers of Ajahn Mahabua, who are like extremely ascetic, you know, just kind of tough, you know, hardcore renunciants, something like that. So let's see. I'll just move on to Phil Lathy's next question. What do you think are the greatest character flaws of the Zoomer generation, ignoring extreme leftists? Zoomers, that's like the teenagers now. I really don't have a lot of exposure to Zoomers. So it's hard for me to say. I mean, I already mentioned above that my generation is different from like the current generation, which I assume is Zoomers, just mainly through we had greater independence. The Zoomers tend to be more conformist, either conformist to leftist insanity or rightist insanity, but still they seem to be kind of more feminized, weaker, softer, and more conformist, which is pretty much the plan. Although some of them are kind of defying the plan because they're conforming to sort of the right-wing counterculture, the counter-revolutionaries. So the Zoomers are actually more conservative than previous generations have been, or so I have read, at least in certain respects. But I really can't psychoanalyze Zoomers very well because I really don't know very many. I really don't interact with teenagers, very young adults lately. So I guess I kind of already answered that in a previous question, and I think I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's next question, which is, do you think Plato is a good philosopher if you have read him? Yeah, I've read pretty much everything that Plato wrote except the Laws. The Laws was one of his longest works. And I considered it to have been interesting. I think I was kind of looking forward to reading it, but I just never got around to reading Plato's Laws. But I've read pretty much everything else he wrote, or at least everything else attributed to him. And was he a good philosopher? For his time, he was a good philosopher, although I really am not impressed by Plato. I'm not impressed by Aristotle either, for that matter. There's an old saying that everyone is either a Platonist or an Aristotelian, whether they realize it or not, but I really don't think I'm either. Like, I just have no use for Plato's universals. There's like the Plato's heaven with like the ideal dog, and every dog on earth is like influenced, you know, to some degree. One of its factors is this divine dogness, you know, the perfect dog, and it's just sort of filtered through the imperfections of the earth, of worldliness or some such. Yeah, I got no use for that. Like his simile of the cave is probably his best philosophy that I've read. There's one dialogue by Plato where he's making fun of sophists, And I mean, that's just good reading. That's like comedy. So he was a better comedian than a philosopher there, I guess. Where it's like somebody asks somebody, "Is that your dog?" And the guy says, "Yeah." And it's like, "It's a father, you know." And then the other person says, "Yeah, I saw him mate with the female, so I know the puppies are his." And so then the sophist says, "Well, it's yours and it's a father, therefore that dog is your father and the puppies are your brothers." So I mean, it's kind of funny. Just this whole dialogue is like that, of these sophists just kind of making fools of others while making fools of themselves at the same time. But yeah, I'm really not impressed by Plato. I just am not. So, I mean, he was a good philosopher at the time, I guess. You know, he was very influential as a philosopher at the time. You know, he's definitely made waves. So I assume, like, within the context of like classical Greek culture, he was a great philosopher. But I do think he's obsolete at this point. You know, sort of like some of the early scientists came up with important stuff. They were great scientists, geniuses, but it's just that nobody's reading who reads Galileo anymore? Because he's been superseded by later developments. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And I'm scrolling down here. Yeah, we don't have very much more to it. We're getting towards the end here. Trouble not, no trouble. So Siddhartha Lohachita says, could we say that the swastika or the sawatika, I guess that would be Pali for swastika, in Pali is a symbol of Buddhism because each arm is one of the Four Noble Truths? I heard the word swastika, it means the good, similar to the Greek word kalos, as in Plato's kalocracy, the rule of the good. Kalocracy, I guess. Well, first of all, the meaning of swastika is it's essentially a prefix, a root, and a suffix. The prefix is su, which is the same Proto-Indo-European etymology as the Greek word EU. It just means good, or well. And ata here it means like welfare, or it can also mean the goal in Pali, but here I think it just means like, you know, like prosperity. You know, like the Artha Shastra in Sanskrit is, you know, sort of like the science, the text on like worldly prosperity. And then the ka at the end is just a prefix that doesn't necessarily have a whole bunch of have any like real meaning to it. Swastika, it can kind of turn things into like an adjective, but here swastika, literally in Sanskrit, it means something like true welfare, true benefit, something like that, and it was like a good luck sign in ancient India. So I'm not sure about Buddhism adopting it, going counterclockwise instead of clockwise like later Germans did. I'm not sure that the four arms represent the Four Noble Truths. It may be later that was sort of retconned into it. But it's my understanding that the swastika originally was just a symbol for the sun. And the Buddha is considered to be a kinsman of the sun. You know, he came from a solar race, according to ancient Indian culture. So it could be more along those lines. And I would assume the swastika existed before Buddhism did. And so it wouldn't really represent the Four Noble Truths other than just retconning the symbolism onto the four arms of the Hakenkreuz. But originally, I think it just was a symbol of the sun, and it may be that originally the early Buddhists adopted it because the Buddha was kinsman of the sun or some such, and that, you know, just somebody came up with an idea later. Hey, there's four arms, Four Noble Truths. That's what it means. But who knows? I really don't know. That's just my educated guess. As I pull on my beard sideways. So let's see here. Siddhartha Lohachita's second question. does something like collective karma exist, or something like the fate of nations, so to speak? I've answered this question a number of times. In Theravada Buddhism, there is really no such thing as collective karma. Sort of like in evolutionary biology, there's no like group evolution. You know, it's always the individual that survives or doesn't survive to pass on its genes, and it makes the appearance of kind of a group evolution. And I think there are some evolutionary scientists who will say, okay, there is a kind of group evolution, like an entire group can survive or not survive, that kind of thing. But with regard to karma, according to Theravada Buddhism, it's all individual karma, even though the individual is ultimately an illusion. But what happens is, it seems like you've got like regional karma or collective karma. Like the Middle East has been a battlefield since prehistoric times. You know, it just seems like the Middle East is just doomed to be a battlefield. All kinds of violence and stuff going on in the Middle East since prehistoric times, with few exceptions to the rule. So the way you would explain that is that people with the same kind of violent karma are going to be reborn into this kind of violent culture. So it seems like group karma, but really it's the individual karma is causing you to be reborn, according to the theory, in this certain society where your violent karma is more likely to reach fruition. And then you just have sort of like the culture, you're just kind of got the karma to wind up in this culture that is in harmony with your karma, and other people are too. Like Edgar Casey, the sleeping prophet. According to him, lots and lots of Americans were Romans, like from the Roman Empire in previous lives. So that in a way, it's like America is like a reincarnation of the Roman Empire, sort of. Maybe we're still at the Republic stage at this point. But, I mean, it's not like there's this group karma causing everybody. It's just like each person's individual karma just fits into this society better. And so it gives the appearance of group karma. Because you've got a group of people who just share similar karma, and that's why they're together. And that's kind of one reason why certain people will continue being reborn, according to the theory, in association with each other, because they've got karma like directed towards each other, like got attachments and so forth that cause this continuation. But it's still the individual's karma in this case and in the other case, and it's not necessarily a kind of group karma. But that's just Orthodox Buddhism. I mean, it can be that if you're not going to be orthodox, you could adopt this idea that there is a kind of group karma, but I might as well be orthodox in this case because it makes it easier. And just keep pulling on this because it's sideways. So, yeah, the official answer would be no, there is no collective karma, at least for a Theravada Buddhist. But you can decide for yourself, I guess, whether a group of people have a kind of group mind, which creates its own entity, like a love relationship, like my woman and me, we've created like a third entity, which is the us, which, I mean, has its own characteristics. So, I mean, if you want to accept that as a kind of new individual that has its own kind of karma, then maybe, although technically speaking, that's not Orthodox Buddhism. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Myo Myat, who I've recently learned apparently is of largely Celtic ancestry, which is kind of strange for someone with the name Myo Myat. Although I did meet a half Irish Burmese person once whose father, I think, was like a soldier in World War II, an Irishman who just settled in Burma because he liked it after the war and raised a family. And so he raised a bunch of half Irish, half Celtic kids in Burma. but I'm not sure exactly what Myomyat's story is here. Anyways, Myomyat says, I heard someone say that when Buddha said a Tathagata neither exists or not exists after death, or both exists and not exists, or both doesn't exist or not exist, that the Buddha was referring to everyone and that the doctrine of rebirth was rejected or not talked about much in early Buddhism. I was wondering what your thoughts on this are from your perspective of studying the Pali scriptures. Well, yeah, I mean, it can bleed over. Like when the Buddha refuses to answer whether a Tathagata exists or doesn't exist after death, that, I mean, there are like complications or ramifications, implications. Like the Buddha, like in one sutta says, I mean, you can't even say whether he exists before he dies. And that's like the whole idea of anatta, really. And also you could sort of apply that to other people. And the Atthakavagga, like, it's the largest chunk of really ancient archaic Buddhism in existence. You know, it's like the largest piece of like pre-Theravada, like just really archaic Buddhist literature still in existence. And I mean, it doesn't mention rebirth that I can think of, not specifically. And it just says, don't believe anything. And a lot of the Buddha's refusal to answer questions may stem from this really archaic Buddhist teaching, in that when you cling to a concept, I mean, concepts cannot really contain the highest truth. It's just samsaric illusion. It's symbols. So the earliest Buddhism, I mean, the whole idea of rebirth was just part of Indian culture. It is becoming established in Indian culture at that time. Like the Upanishads, some of the oldest Upanishads, which were pre-Buddhist, do teach rebirth. And it was, I mean, the Jains obviously believed in rebirth. That was sort of inherited from the Indus Valley civilization, I assume. So, I mean, Buddhists were exposed to the idea. It was a common idea, but there's also this idea that ideas cannot contain reality, that you're not going to understand the highest truth by thinking about it. So, like at a samsaric, like a skillful means kind of level, like with regard to samuti satcha or conventional truth, I would assume that even early Buddhists accepted the idea of rebirth. But when you get beyond conventional truth into ultimate truth, then it's like you can't say anything. You don't say we're reborn. You don't say we're not reborn. You don't believe any of that one way or the other. And it's not because of skepticism, like you can't know. It's just that the truth is, you cannot put the truth into words. It's just anything that's symbolized in language is not going to be the highest truth. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. So, the Buddha, I mean, if he was referring to everyone, then he probably would have said everyone rather than just the Tathagata. But it could be applied to everyone in that sense. I don't think the doctrine of rebirth was rejected any more than the doctrine of no rebirth, because all doctrines were rejected by at least texts like the Atthakavagga. When you get into advanced level Dhamma, you have to leave behind concepts, which includes the concept of rebirth, the concept of enlightenment even. So that would be my thoughts on this, I guess. And I'm going to move on to Myomyat's next question, which is, I've heard you be somewhat critical of a certain celebrity sayadaw in Burma. If you're comfortable with telling, what are your main criticisms of this particular sayadaw? I'm wondering because I'll be ordaining as a samanera at a vihara connected to their organization. Well, I have been somewhat critical of more than one celebrity sayadaws. Like I've been fairly critical of Upandita, for example. But I'm assuming that the certain celebrity sayadaw he's referring to would be Thitigu sayadaw. And when I was a monk, I have to admit, possibly more than any other monk, I pretty much despise Thitigu sayadaw, because he is like a CEO who wears monk's robes in order to make more money. At least that's the way I viewed the situation. For example, just to give one naughty story, and I really I'm only answering this. I'm only talking about this because I was asked this question. I really do not want to bash anybody here, but just to give you an understanding of why I didn't like Theta Gusiero. That just one example is during the rainy season of 1998, I think it was. I spent the rains retreat in Japan. And while I was spending the rains retreat in Japan, I was told this sayadaw also came to Japan. And the first thing he did was he sent a message to Burmese supporters in Japan saying he needs a first class airplane ticket. It's because he had his excuse was he had a bad back. So he had to have a first class ticket. And the Burmese people in Japan are mainly working menial jobs. They're not making a lot of money. Even doctors who go to Japan, I mean, their medical license is worthless in Japan. A Burmese medical license counts for nothing in Japan. So you're going to have like even doctors in Burma come to Japan. They're waiting tables or some such. So anyways, he requires this money. Then he gets there. Somebody goes to him offering him a robe. He says, I don't need robes. I don't want robes. I want money. And so they offered a certain amount of money. He says, I need more than that. Give me more than that. And then after they set him up in a hotel room. He like complains that the hotel room isn't nice enough, even though these people are like spending as much money as they can afford, maybe even a little more than they can afford for this famous sayadaw. He essentially chews them out for giving him a substandard hotel room, supposedly a renunciant. Then he says, all right, I need a first class plane ticket to America. He wanted to go to America next. He's traveling during the rains retreat. That's just the tippy top of the iceberg, which is, I mean, traveling during the rains retreat's against the rules, but I mean, so is handling money. So he says he needs like $7,000 to go to America, plus a first class plane ticket. So they come up with the money. He gets to America, and then he like contacts them saying he needs $7,000 more. And I mean, this was just his MO. This is just the way he operated. He was like a fundraiser, and a lot of the money is for like establishing Sangha hospitals. Like when the tropical storm Nagas like hit southern Burma, he was collecting money to help the refugees. But I mean, that's layperson's work. That's not a monk's duty to raise money for like building hospitals and so forth. I mean, you can say it's meritorious for a layperson to do it, but for a monk to do it, he's like a CEO who wears monk's robes in order to make as much money as possible. So yeah, I mean, he's technically Shuijin, which is the strictest like sect of Buddhism, of the two main sects in Buddhism. Sort of like the Dhammayut is considered to be much stricter than the Mahanikaya in Thailand. The Shuijins are sort of like the rough equivalent of Dhammayut in Burma. But I mean, he really did not give a damn about following the rules of monastic discipline. Keeping the precepts. He didn't care. He's kind of based, according to some Western Buddhists that are kind of right-wing, because he's one of the most outspoken endorsers of just kicking all the Muslims out of Burma. But aside from that, I mean, he just charges exorbitant fees, especially by Burmese standards. He just charges exorbitant fees to give Dhamma talks, and it's all just wrong livelihood for a monk. So I considered him to be like a businessman wearing monk's robes in order to make more money. But I'm not 100% sure that this sayadaw in question, who's one of the most famous sayadaws in Burma, he's probably pretty old if he's still alive now. He's got to be in his 80s by now, at least. But I mean, he's very well respected by a lot of Burmese Buddhists in Burma. He's one of the most famous sayadaws in Burma. Very high profile. But sometimes people would like talk about, they wish that he would come to our monastery or something. I'm just like, I would just like move out. I mean, really, I was so strict in my desire to follow precepts correctly and everything in those days that, I mean, he just seemed like a disgrace to the robes he was wearing. And I just didn't want to have anything to do with him. I didn't meet him once or twice, but I guess I can just move on to the next question, which is the last question, the very last one. So this is going about 3 hours, isn't it? Damn. Oh well. That's okay. That's why I'm here. And this question got squeaked in under the wire. This is the last question that was asked, just a matter of minutes before I got started on this. What are your thoughts on the recent American bombings in Iran? And I mean, I already kind of touched on this in a previous question. Well, I really didn't vote for the bombing of Iran, but as I mentioned previously, I think most people in the West agree that Iran should not have nukes because Iran is essentially run by a terrorist organization that supports terrorism around the world, and they have vowed over and over again, death to Israel, death to America, death to the West, the great Satan of the West and all that. So I think most people in the West would agree that it's better that Iran not have nuclear weapons. Americans, I mean, they agree on, like the majority of Americans agree on that, but they also agree that they don't want America to like have a ground war in Iran like they had in Iraq and Afghanistan that just bogs down into a kind of Vietnam scenario. So I think at first most people were hoping the Israelis, who were just kind of like unleashed, it's like one of the first things America does after Israel starts bombing Iran is, this is unilateral on the side of Israel. We're not doing this, because everyone's kind of hoping that Israel would just kind of take matters into their own hand. But it turned out that there were like some deep underground facilities that Israel just didn't have the weaponry to take out. Only America supposedly did. And supposedly they dropped numerous bunker buster bombs and then followed up by dropping Moabs, these mothers of all bombs, these huge bombs, so that presumably where these places were are just now a big crater. They just wanted to make real sure they destroyed these things. So, I mean, I didn't vote for it, but I assume that from a political point of view, the president of the United States knows a hell of a lot more about the situation than most people just reading stuff on X. So, I mean, I'm willing to, I voted for Trump, and I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that he knows what he's doing. And in a masculine society, more so than in a feminized society, you have to be willing to take risks. No gut, no glory. So, I'm just waiting to see what happens. I mean, there's a very good chance there's going to be retaliation. Very good chance of that. That's one of the two main disadvantages of America bombing these nuclear sites in Iran. One, there's going to be a lot of like right wingers, especially, who are saying, Trump is just Israel's puppet, Zion Dawn. He's just doing the bidding of Israel, which is really a simplistic, one-sided way of looking at it, because it's to the advantage of pretty much everyone in the West that Iran has its nuclear program destroyed, because they're obviously not willing to stop. And if they do get a nuke, there's a good chance they're going to be using it. So that's one reason, is it's just going to cause a lot of the MAGA base to kind of turn against Trump because he's just a puppet of Israel, which, it really is like a simplistic kind of narrow view of the situation in this particular case. And the other thing is, of course, Iran is vowing retaliation, and there's a good chance that they're going to cause at least a few Americans to explode as a result of this. But if America is going to be a Chad superpower, there's going to have to be some militarism and strong decisive action and some risk taking. So I'm just saying, well, I voted for the guy. He's doing this stuff. He knows better than I do what the implications of this are. I mean, he's getting all kinds of the best intel on, how we're going to do this and what's the likely ramifications of this. So, yeah, I'm just sitting back and waiting and seeing. Just, who knows? I mean, like I've said before, when I was a young man, I lost interest in politics when I realized that what is good and right from a political point of view is not necessarily good and right from a dharmic point of view. So you just have to kind of dissociate spirituality from politics to some degree, because from a spiritual point of view, war is just mass murder. That's what it is. But from a political point of view, sometimes war is necessary or just so expedient that it's just the thing to do. So we're just going to have to wait and see. But I'm not overly concerned. I didn't lose any sleep last night over America dropping huge multi-ton bombs onto Iranian nuclear research facilities. And we're just going to have to wait and see. And even if there is retaliation, and even if some people in the MAGA base turn against Trump because he's suddenly a warmonger and puppet of Netanyahu and all that, still there is a good chance that it was the right thing to do from a political point of view. And I'm just willing to observe with interest what happens next. And that's it. That's the last question. So, like I always should say at the beginning, and never do, except for on one dubious occasion, if you have anything that you think I can answer, especially Buddhism-oriented or spirituality-oriented, Dharma in sort of the wider sense, politics, economics. I mean, sometimes I might have something of use to say on the subject, but generally, economics especially, not much interest in that. Politics, kind of, but I'm no authority. I'm no real expert on that. So, early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, meditation, Buddhism in general, just ancient Indian culture, that kind of thing, I can answer fairly well, usually. And like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.